The desert stretched before Marcus Stone like a burnt offering, all red dust and skeleton brush clawing at a sky too white to look at directly. He led his horse through the narrow pass where the rocks rose sharp enough to gut a man who stumbled his rifle loose across the saddle horn, his eyes tracking the ground for prints that would tell him if the traps held anything worth the 3-hour ride from the cabin. 38 years breathing this air, and most of those years alone now, the kind of alone that settled into a man's bones, like winter cold, that never quite left even when summer scorched the earth to cinders. The horse's ears flicked forward before Marcus heard it, that subtle shift in the animal's attention. That meant something living occupied the space ahead. His hand found the rifle without thought, 5 years of muscle memory since he'd stopped trusting the world not to take everything from him again. The dry creek bed curved around a tumble of boulders, worn smooth by water that hadn't run here in a decade, and there in the shade cast by the overhang lay a man so still Marcus's first thought was corpse. Apache. Even from 20 feet, Marcus could read the signs in the way the buckskin lay against weathered limbs, the beadwork pattern on the moccasins that spoke of southern bands, the silver in hair that hung past shoulders barely wider than the rifle stock Marcus still held ready. The old man's chest moved shallow enough that Marcus had to watch for 3 breaths before he was certain life remained in that body. Every instinct Marcus had cultivated in the years since Sarah and Emily died told him to turn the horse ride back the way he'd come, let the desert take what the desert always took eventually. Apache had killed his family 5 years ago, while he'd been 3 days south on cavalry patrol, tracking Comanche raiders who'd never materialized because the intelligence had been wrong, had always been wrong, and when he'd ridden home through smoke and silence, he'd found his wife in the doorway, with an arrow through her throat, and his daughter in the bedroom with her skull caved in by a war club. Different tribe, different band, different men entirely from this dying elder, but the hatred had roots deeper than reason. Marcus dismounted. The old man's eyes opened to slits when Marcus's shadow fell across his face, pupils struggling to focus. Lips cracked so badly the skin had split in 3 places and leaked clear fluid that wasn't quite blood. The Apache's voice came out like wind through dry grass, barely louder than his breathing. "Water, just little." Marcus pulled the canteen from his saddle, knelt in the dust, lifted the old man's head with a hand that remembered cradling his daughter when fever had taken her at age 4 before the raid, when death had still been something preventable with cold compresses and whispered prayers. The Apache drank in small sips, his throat working like he'd forgotten how to swallow properly, and after 6 mouthfuls he lifted one hand in a gesture that meant enough. The bruising across his ribs showed purple-black through skin darkened by decades under the sun, the pattern consistent with a fall from significant height. Marcus looked up at the cliff face towering above them, saw the disturbed rocks 30 feet up, where something had given way beneath weight. Hunting maybe, or fleeing something, or just old legs betraying their owner on terrain that demanded perfection. The Apache's eyes tracked Marcus's face with an intensity that seemed mismatched to his broken body, reading something in the white man's expression that made the old man's hand reach up trembling to touch Marcus's wrist where it supported his head. "You good man. Dead now." Marcus didn't understand until later what those words meant, what they set in motion, what they would cost him and give him in equal measure. He just hoisted the old man onto his back, felt the sharp angles of ribs and spine press against his shoulder blades, and started the long walk back to the cabin, while his horse followed behind, carrying both their weights in expectation. The journey took 4 hours. The sun moved from overhead to western slant, throwing their shadows long across the desert floor, and twice Marcus had to stop to give the old man water to adjust his grip, to breathe through the burn in his legs and back that reminded him he wasn't the cavalry scout he'd been at 30. The Apache drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring in his own language, sometimes silent for so long. Marcus checked for breath against his neck. When the cabin finally came into view, a dark square against red earth, with the barn standing tilted beside it like a drunk leaning on a friend, Marcus felt relief wash through him, followed immediately by uncertainty about what happened next. He had no medicine beyond whiskey and the basic field kit from his cavalry days, no knowledge of Apache healing practices, no idea if the old man would survive the night, even with shelter and water, and the thin blankets Marcus kept in the chest beside his bed. He laid the Apache on his own mattress, the only bed in the single-room cabin, and built up the fire against the walls and drove out the permanent chill that lived in spaces where only one person breathed. The old man's eyes opened fully for the first time when Marcus wrapped him in both blankets in the worn quilt Sarah had stitched during her first pregnancy, back when the world had still held the possibility of sons and daughters growing up in this house. Name, Dakota. The word came clearer now, shaped by a tongue that had found moisture again. You name Marcus Stone. Dakota's hand emerged from the blanket's extended palm, up in a gesture Marcus recognized from his cavalry days as greeting and gratitude combined. He took the offered hand, felt the bones shift under paper-thin skin, released it gently. I thank you, Marcus Stone. You give me good death in warm place, better than cold canyon. Dakota's smile showed teeth worn down to nubs. But first we talk. You listen. Marcus pulled the stool close to the bed, settled onto wood he'd worn smooth over 5 years of solitary meals and solitary thinking. Outside night fell fast, the way it always did in the desert. No transition, just day and then darkness. He fed the fire and waited. Dakota spoke slowly, pausing often to catch breath that rattled in his chest like seeds in a dried gourd. He'd been hunting alone against his daughter's wishes because at 70 winters, he refused to be treated as burden to his band. The cliff had crumbled beneath him during the pursuit of a bighorn sheep, sent him tumbling through air and stone until he'd fetched up in the creek bed with ribs broken and his head split open where Marcus couldn't see beneath the hair. He'd lain there a full day before Marcus found him, accepting death, making peace with ancestors, ready for the journey to the spirit world. But you change this. You give water. You carry me. Life debt now exists. Dakota's eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that seemed to demand understanding. My people, we honor debts, especially life debt. You understand? Marcus nodded, though he didn't, not really. Not the weight those words carried in Apache custom. Dakota seemed satisfied, regardless, settled deeper into the blankets, closed his eyes. His breathing evened out into something approaching sleep. For 2 days, Dakota lived. Marcus fed him thin broth made from the dried beef he kept in stores, gave him water every hour, changed the blankets when fever sweat soaked through. The old man's strength flickered like a candle in wind, sometimes bright enough to sustain conversation, more often dim to the point of absence. On the second night, as Marcus dozed in the chair he'd pulled beside the bed, Dakota's hand gripped his wrist hard enough to wake him. Listen now, important. The old man's voice carried urgency that overrode his weakness. When I die, my people come. They bring payment for life debt. You must accept. Something in Marcus's chest tightened with the premonition that acceptance carried consequences he couldn't yet see. But Dakota's grip demanded agreement, and 5 years of grief had taught Marcus that dying men deserved whatever peace you could give them, even if that peace was a lie. I'll accept. Dakota's hand released. His face smoothed into something approaching contentment. 3 hours later, as dawn light began painting the eastern sky pale gold, he stopped breathing. Marcus sat beside the body until full sunrise, then carried Dakota outside and laid him on the ground in front of the cabin, arranged the blankets around him with care, placed his own best knife in the old man's hand, because he remembered that Apache warriors traveled to the spirit world armed. The band came 2 days after that. Marcus was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard horses, multiple riders moving slow like a funeral procession. He walked around the front with the axe still in his hand, not threat, but not careless either, and found 6 Apache warriors mounted on painted ponies, an old woman on a gray mare, and behind them all a figure that made Marcus's breath catch despite himself. She sat a horse the color of dried blood, and she had to duck beneath the low branches of the cottonwood that shaded his well because her height put her head level with foliage that cleared Marcus by a foot. Broad shoulders strained against the buckskin dress, she wore muscles clearly defined, along arms that belonged on a man accustomed to swinging hammers or hauling timber. Her face combined strength and sorrow in equal measure, high cheekbones, and a jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as the cliffs, eyes dark as the space between stars. The old woman dismounted, walked to where Dakota lay wrapped in Marcus's blankets, knelt beside the body, with a keening cry that carried across the desert, and came back changed. The warriors sat their horses in silence, hands loose on reins, watching Marcus with expressions he couldn't read. The tall woman didn't move from her saddle, didn't look anywhere but at some point past Marcus's shoulder, as if meeting his eyes would cost her something she couldn't afford to pay. After the old woman finished her morning song, she stood and approached Marcus with steps that covered ground fast despite her age. Her English came accented but clear-shaped by someone who'd learned the language through necessity rather than choice. "You are Marcus Stone. You saved Dakota, gave him good death in warm place." She gestured back toward the tall woman. "This is payment for life debt. Her name is Anya. She is widow. She serves you now." The words landed like stones in still water ripples, spreading out to touch everything they reached. Marcus looked past the old woman to Anya, saw her flinch at the word serves as if it had physical weight, saw something that might have been shame or might have been rage flicker across her face before she smoothed it away into blankness. "I don't want payment. I don't need anyone to serve me." Marcus kept his voice level, aware of the 6 warriors sitting horses behind the old woman, aware that cultural misunderstanding could turn fatal faster than drawing breath. "I helped Dakota because it was right. That's all." The old woman's face hardened into lines deep as canyons. "You insult us by refusing. Life debt must be paid. Anya has no place in tribe now. Her husband dead. No sons, no value. She comes to you or she dies. These are only choices." Anya's hands tightened on her reins hard enough that the horse shifted beneath her ears, flicking back. Her jaw muscles worked like she was chewing words she couldn't afford to speak, and Marcus saw her throat move as she swallowed whatever protest wanted to climb out of her chest. When she finally spoke, her English was rougher than the old woman's, shaped by a tongue that fought against the foreign sounds. "If you send me back, they kill me. For refusing duty. For having no use." Her eyes met his for the first time, and the impact of that gaze felt like standing too close to a lightning strike. "Please, let me stay." The warriors hadn't moved, but their stillness carried the tension of men waiting to see which way violence would fall. Marcus looked at Dakota's body, at the old woman's implacable expression, at Anya sitting her horse like she was carved from the same wood, and felt the weight of choices that weren't really choices at all pressing down on his shoulders. She can stay, but not to serve, just to stay. He met the old woman's eyes, held them. "That's the only way I accept." Something passed across the old woman's face, too quick to name there and gone before Marcus could identify it as approval, or contempt, or something between. She turned to Anya, spoke in Apache, a long string of words that made the younger woman's face go blank as new paper. Then the old woman remounted her gray mare, and the warriors turned their horses as one, and within minutes the only evidence of their presence was dust settling back to earth and Dakota's body wrapped in Marcus's blankets. Anya dismounted slowly, as if her body had forgotten how joints worked. She stood taller than Marcus by half a head, broader through the shoulders than most men he'd served with in the cavalry, and up close he could see the faint white lines of old scars tracing her forearms and the backs of her hands, the kind of marks that came from blocking blows rather than taking them square. She held herself with the rigid control of someone who'd learned that any movement might be interpreted as attack or insubordination. Marcus gestured toward the cabin. "There's space inside. You can sleep by the fire." Anya looked at the door like it was a mouth waiting to swallow her. She shook her head once sharp enough to disturb the black hair that hung past her shoulders. "I sleep outside. Better." Before Marcus could argue, she took her horse to the lean-to beside the barn, unsaddled with efficient movements that suggested years of practice, then carried her bedroll to the far side of the cabin, where the overhang provided minimal shelter. She spread the blankets against the wall, sat down on them with her back to the wood, and didn't move again. Even as afternoon bled into evening and the temperature began its nightly plummet toward freezing. Marcus stood in his doorway, watching her sit there in the gathering dark. This woman the tribe had given him, like property. This stranger whose life now depended on his acceptance of a debt he'd never wanted. He went inside, built up the fire, ate a cold supper of dried meat and hard bread, and tried not to think about the fact that another human being was sleeping outside in December, while he occupied a cabin with a working stove. Near midnight, he finally walked outside with one of his blankets approached, where Anya sat with her eyes closed, but her body still holding that rigid alertness that suggested sleep hadn't come. He stopped at the edge of her blankets, held out the additional covering. "It's going to drop below freezing tonight. You'll need this." She opened her eyes, looked at the blanket, then at him. Her voice came quiet as falling dust. I don't deserve walls, or extra blankets, or kindness from white men who save Apache elders. She drew her knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms around them. I sleep here, where I belong. The words carried weight that suggested history Marcus didn't know. Trauma that went deeper than cultural exile. He laid the blanket beside her anyway, close enough that she could reach it if she changed her mind, and walked back to the cabin, feeling like he'd failed some test he hadn't known he was taking. He woke 2 hours before dawn to the sound of hammering, rhythmic and steady, coming from somewhere above his head. Marcus rolled out of bed, grabbed his rifle from habit, stepped outside into air cold enough to burn his lungs. The stars still crowded the sky, wall to wall, providing just enough light to make out Anya's form on the barn roof, silhouetted against the eastern horizon, driving nails with a hammer she must have found in his shed. He climbed the ladder he kept, leaned against the barn's south side, pulled himself onto the roof that sagged dangerously to the west, where rot had taken 3 support beams 2 winters ago. Anya didn't pause in her work. When he emerged beside her, just kept hammering new planks across the weakened section with hands that moved too fast, too sure, like she'd been doing this kind of work her whole life. I was going to fix. Marcus offered more to fill silence than because explanation was needed. Spring too late. Next storm roof falls. Kills any horse stupid enough to stand under. Anya gestured with the hammer toward the pile of fresh-cut boards beside her. You had wood, just needed putting up. Marcus looked at the work she'd already completed in the hour since waking, saw that she'd ripped out all the rotted supports and replaced them with new beams cut from his lumber stores, had braced the weak joints and re-shingled a section he'd been meaning to address for 8 months. The physical strength required to do that work alone in darkness, in freezing cold, went beyond what most men could manage. Where did you learn to do this? Husband made me build things. Said I was strong like man should work like man. Her hammer came down hard enough to drive the nail flush in a single stroke. Tribe agreed after he died. Said I was too big, too ugly, too much like warrior. Good for labor. Nothing else. The bitterness in those words tasted like copper on the back of Marcus's tongue, familiar as his own resentment toward cavalry commanders who'd sent him 3 days south on bad intelligence, while his family died 3 miles from the fort. He sat down on the roof beside where she worked, watched her hands move in darkness with the confidence of extensive practice. The tribe was wrong about the nothing else part. Anya's hammer paused mid-swing. She turned her head to look at him, and in the starlight, her face carried an expression that might have been surprise or might have been suspicion, hard to distinguish between the two. Why you let me stay, real reason. White men don't help Apache widows. White men don't refuse payment that looks like me. Marcus thought about his daughter's room with its door still locked 5 years later, about Sarah's dresses still hanging in the chest because he couldn't bring himself to burn them or give them away, about the way he'd spent half a decade punishing himself by living in the space where they'd died. He thought about Dakota's hand gripping his wrist and the old man's face in the moment before death, peaceful in a way Marcus hadn't felt since before he had ridden home through smoke. I'm tired of letting people die when I could help them live. That's the real reason. Anya studied his face for a long time, long enough that Marcus felt the weight of her attention like physical pressure against his skin. Then she nodded once, turned back to her hammering, drove 6 more nails before speaking again. Anya is name tribe gave me. Name means belongs to in our language. Belongs to father, belongs to husband, belongs to debt. She set down the hammer, flexed her hands like they ached. I want different name. Name that is mine. Just mine. The request caught Marcus off guard in its directness, its vulnerability, the way it suggested she'd been thinking about this for longer than the few hours since arriving. He looked at her profile against the stars. This woman who'd been sent to him like property, but who rebuilt barns before dawn because waiting until spring risked lives. That's something you should choose yourself, not something I give you. Then I choose dawn. She picked up the hammer again, tested its weight like she was remembering how to hold it. Because when I came here at sunrise yesterday, something started. Something different than before. I want name for that new thing. Dawn. Marcus let the words settle in his mind, tested how it felt to call this stranger by a name she'd chosen instead of one given to her by people who saw her as burden. It fit her better than Anya carried less weight of ownership and more suggestion of beginning. Dawn it is then. She didn't smile, but something in her shoulders loosened fractionally, tension bleeding away in small increments that suggested relief too large to show all at once. They sat together on the barn roof while the skies slowly lightened toward day, and Marcus found himself thinking that maybe Dakota's death had led somewhere neither of them expected, somewhere that might contain healing if they were brave enough to reach for it. Over the following days, a pattern emerged between them, careful and wordless. Dawn woke before Marcus every morning, always outside no matter how cold the night had been, and by the time he emerged from the cabin, she'd already completed some task he'd been avoiding. The fence around the horse paddock that had leaned drunkenly for 2 years stood straight and reinforced. The loose stones in the fireplace chimney were mortared back into place. The water barrel that had leaked a gallon a day since last summer sat sealed and waterproof against the cabin wall. She worked with an intensity that suggested work was easier than thinking, safer than feeling a refuge from whatever thoughts wanted to surface if she stayed still too long. Marcus recognized the impulse because he'd lived it for 5 years, staying busy enough that grief couldn't catch him, tired enough each night that sleep came before memory could torture him with what he'd lost. He tried to give her space, tried not to hover, but found himself watching her anyway when he thought she couldn't see. The way her hands moved with absolute confidence when handling tools or horses, the way her body flowed through physical tasks with an economy of motion that spoke of years spent performing labor. The way she flinched when he approached too quickly, then covered the flinch with stillness as if showing fear was more dangerous than whatever had made her afraid. On the fourth evening, Marcus carried 2 plates of food outside to where Dawn sat against the cabin wall, her usual spot now worn smooth by repeated sitting. He held 1 plate out to her, waited until she took it with hands that trembled slightly before she steadied them. They ate in silence while the sun painted the western horizon in shades of crimson and gold, and Marcus felt the quiet between them shift from uncomfortable to something approaching companionable. "Tribe said you had family once." Dawn's voice startled him out of thoughts about whether he needed to ride to town for more supplies before snow closed the pass. "Old woman told me, said you understand loss." Marcus's chest constricted around his next breath, grief always close under his skin even after 5 years. "Wife and daughter, they were killed in a raid while I was on patrol, 5 years ago now." Dawn nodded slowly like he'd confirmed something she'd already guessed. "My husband beat me for 7 years. Started after I lost baby to miscarriage. He said I was cursed, broken, worthless, without sons." She set her empty plate as they wrapped her arms around her knees. "He died falling off horse while drunk. Tribe blamed me. Said my curse killed him. Made me widow property because I had no value left." The casual way she delivered those facts as if reciting someone else's story made Marcus's hands curl into fists against his thighs. He forced them open, forced his voice to stay level instead of filling with the rage that wanted to spill out at a tribe that treated women like defective livestock, at a husband who'd beaten his wife for biology beyond her control, at a world that made people like Dawn believe they deserved to sleep outside in December. "You're not cursed, broken, and you're sure as hell not worthless." The words came out harder than he intended, sharp enough that Dawn's head snapped toward him, eyes wide. "Whatever that tribe told you, whatever your husband made you believe, it was lies. All of it." Dawn stared at him like he'd spoken a language she was still learning to understand, like the concepts he'd offered were foreign enough to require translation. Her throat worked as she swallowed once, twice, and when she spoke again, her voice came rough as sand on stone. "You don't know me, don't know what I did, what I'm capable of. I know you rebuilt my barn before dawn because you didn't want my horses at risk. I know you chose your own name because you wanted something that belonged to you. I know you're sitting out here in the cold because someone convinced you that you don't deserve better." Marcus met her eyes, held them despite the intensity that lived in that gaze. "That's enough for me to know the tribe was wrong." Silence stretched between them, vast as the desert, deep as the space between stars. Dawn's hands tightened on her knees hard enough that her knuckles went pale against her dark skin, and Marcus saw her jaw muscles flex like she was physically restraining words that wanted to escape. When she finally spoke, it came out barely above a whisper. "Thank you for saying that, even if you're wrong." He wanted to argue, wanted to list every reason she was worth more than tribal exile and sleeping outside and names that meant belongs to. But something in her expression stopped him. This was enough for tonight. Small steps toward healing, tiny increments of progress the same way he'd learned to live again after Sarah and Emily died. You didn't rebuild a person overnight any more than you rebuilt a burned house overnight. You just put up one beam at a time and hoped the structure held. They sat together until full dark fell, until the temperature dropped enough that Marcus's breath showed white in the air, and then Dawn stood and walked back to her sleeping spot, while Marcus went inside and lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman outside his wall, who believed she didn't deserve shelter. Near midnight, he heard the sounds of her moving, quiet scrapes of blankets, shifting boots, scuffing against earth. He thought maybe she was adjusting position, getting more comfortable, but the sounds continued too long for that explanation. Marcus got up, pulled on his coat, stepped outside into darkness, profound enough that the stars seemed close enough to touch. Dawn was walking the perimeter of his property, 30 yards out from the cabin, moving with a deliberate pace that suggested patrol rather than restlessness. Her hand rested on something at her hip, and as Marcus's eyes adjusted, he realized she was armed, carrying a knife she must have had hidden on her person since arriving. She covered the ground with efficiency that spoke of military training or something close to it, and when she completed one circuit, she started another, never breaking stride. Dawn. He kept his voice low to avoid startling her. What are you doing? She turned toward him without pause in her patrol, and even in starlight, he could see the alertness in her face, the way her body held ready for threat. Watching, making sure no one comes. No one's coming. We're 20 miles from the nearest town, 40 from the fort. Marcus walked toward her, carefully, hands visible, non-threatening. You can sleep. It's safe here. Nowhere is safe, not for me. But she stopped walking, faced him fully, and the exhaustion in her face went deeper than physical weariness. Tribe knows where I am. Husband's brothers might come. Bounty hunters who chase Apache might come. White settlers who hate my people might come. I stay ready. The logic was sound, even if it emerged from trauma, and Marcus couldn't argue with the assessment of risk, because she was right that any of those threats could materialize. But watching her stand patrol in freezing darkness because she believed safety was illusion felt like witnessing someone drown in shallow water, preventable if only he could find the right words to convince her to stand up. Come inside, please, just for tonight, just to sleep somewhere warm. He gestured toward the cabin. I'll keep watch if you need someone to keep watch, but you need rest more than I need you protecting me. Dawn looked at the cabin door like it was a trap, looked at Marcus like he might be bait for that trap, looked back toward the darkness surrounding them, like it offered more safety than walls and fire. Her internal struggle played across her face in micro-expressions he was learning to read, conflict between what she wanted and what she believed she deserved. I can't. If I go inside, I'll... She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. You'll what? I'll start to hope. The words emerged broken, carried weight that spoke of hope as something dangerous rather than sustaining. Hope is what gets you hurt. Hope is what makes you believe things can be different. And when they're not different, when everything goes back to how it was, the hoping makes it worse. Marcus understood that logic because he'd lived it himself, had spent 5 years refusing to hope for anything, because hope felt like betrayal of the family he'd lost, like moving forward meant abandoning them in the past. But standing in December darkness, watching this woman choose cold over comfort because she was afraid to believe she deserved better, felt like watching himself from the outside, seeing clearly what grief and trauma did when you let them rule your choices. Then just come inside for tonight. Don't hope about tomorrow. Don't think about what it means. Just be warm for 8 hours. He held out his hand, an offering without expectation. That's all. Dawn stared at his hand for a long time, so long Marcus thought she'd refuse, thought he'd have to walk back inside alone and leave her to her patrol. But then slowly she reached out and took it. Her grip was strong enough to hurt, desperate enough to suggest she was holding on to something more than just his hand. And when he tugged gently toward the cabin, she followed with steps that looked like they cost her something vital. Inside, the fire had burned down to coals, but still radiated heat that made the single room feel almost tropical after the outside cold. Dawn stopped just past the threshold, looked around the space with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read, taking in the simple furniture. The locked door to what had been Emily's room, the bed in the corner with its worn quilt, the basin and pitcher on the table, the rifle mounted above the fireplace. "You can have the bed. I'll sleep in the chair." Marcus moved to gather blankets for himself, but Dawn's hand on his arm stopped him. "No, I sleep on floor. You take bed." Her voice carried finality that suggested this wasn't negotiable. "I'm not used to soft things anymore. Floor is better." He wanted to argue but recognized the futility the way some battles because winning them cost more than letting them go. He handed her blankets and a pillow, watched her arrange them near the fireplace with careful precision, laid down on them without removing her boots or knife. She turned on her side facing the door, body still holding that alert tension, like sleep was something she'd forgotten how to allow. Marcus climbed into his own bed fully dressed except for boots and lay there listening to Dawn's breathing, failed to even out into sleep, listening to her shift positions every few minutes, listening to the cabin settle around them both like it was adjusting to accommodate a second heartbeat in its walls. Hours passed before he finally drifted off, and the last thing he was aware of was Dawn's breathing, finally slowing into something that might have been rest. He woke to the sound of the door opening, sat up fast with his hand reaching for the rifle that wasn't on the nightstand, where it should have been, hard hammering from zero to combat ready in the space between breaths. Dawn stood in the doorway with his rifle in her hands, pointing toward the pre-dawn darkness outside. Her body coiled tight as a spring about to release. "Someone's coming. 3 riders, coming fast." Marcus was across the room in 4 strides, took the rifle from her hands, and checked the load by feel. 3 riders coming fast toward an isolated homestead. Before dawn meant nothing good, meant threat arriving on horseback, with intentions that probably involved taking something that wasn't theirs. He moved to the window, peered through the gap in the shutters, saw the shapes Dawn had spotted resolving into detail as they approached. 3 men white-mounted on horses that had been ridden hard, if the foam on their flanks meant anything. They pulled up 20 yards from the cabin, and the lead rider called out in a voice that carried threat even before the words registered. "We're looking for an Apache woman. Big woman, tall as a man. Word is she was sent out this way to pay some debt. You seen anybody like that around here?" Marcus stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready, positioned his body between the riders and the cabin door where Dawn stood just inside, watching through the gap. He kept his voice level, empty of emotion, the tone he'd used during cavalry negotiations with hostile parties. "Nobody here belongs to you. Nobody here is any of your concern. You can ride on." The lead rider, a man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, spat into the dust and grinned like Marcus had told a joke. "See, that's where you're wrong. That Apache woman, there's people who'd pay good money to return her to her tribe. Bounty on her head says she's stolen property. So if she's here, we're taking her back. If you're hiding her, that makes you an accomplice." Behind Marcus, through the cabin wall, he heard Dawn move, heard the scrape of boot on floor. That meant she was positioning herself for whatever came next. His finger found the trigger guard, not threatening yet, but ready to become threat the instant these 3 made the wrong choice. "I'm going to say this once more. There's nothing here for you. Ride away while you still can." The second rider, younger than the leader, pulled his coat back to show a pistol on his hip. "Maybe we just take a look inside, make sure you're telling the truth." The third rider started to dismount, and that's when Dawn stepped through the door. She moved faster than Marcus expected, crossing the porch in 2 strides, covering the distance to the dismounting man in 3 more. And before any of them fully processed what was happening, she had him by his collar, had lifted him off the ground with one arm, had thrown him into the dust hard enough that his hat went flying, and his breath left his lungs in an explosive whoosh. The other 2 riders went for their guns, but Marcus had his rifle up and aimed before their hands cleared leather. "Don't!" Dawn stood over the man in the dust, one boot pressed against his chest, her face carrying an expression that spoke of violence barely held in check. When she spoke, her voice came out cold as January frost. "I am Dawn, not property, not bounty, not yours to take." She pressed down harder with her boot, making the man under her wheeze. "You come back here, I kill you. You tell others to come here, I kill them too. You understand?" The man nodded frantically, hands scrabbling at her boot, unable to dislodge it. The leader on horseback had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating as he looked at Dawn's size, her strength, the absolute certainty in her threat. He yanked his reins, turning his horse, and the second rider followed suit. This ain't over. Tribe's going to hear about this. They're going to come get you themselves. Dawn lifted her boot off the third man's chest, let him scramble up and run for his horse, let all three of them turn tail and ride back the direction they'd come, dust rising behind them in the growing light. She stood there watching until they disappeared over the ridge, then turned to look at Marcus with an expression he couldn't read. Now they know I'm here. Now they'll tell others. I brought danger to your door. Her hands trembled as she lowered them to her sides. You should send me away, before more come, before they hurt you because of me. Marcus lowered his rifle, set it against the porch railing, walked down to where Dawn stood in the yard. He could see it in her face, the preparation for rejection, the expectation that he'd confirm what she already believed about herself, that she was nothing but trouble, nothing but burden, nothing worth the risk of protecting. I'm not sending you away. He kept his voice firm, final, no room for argument. Those men made their choice. Whatever consequences come from that, we face them together. Dawn's face crumbled for just a moment, walls dropping to reveal something raw and wounded underneath, and then she rebuilt them with visible effort, pulled her armor back into place. But her voice when she spoke came thick with emotion she couldn't quite suppress. Why? Why risk everything for someone like me? Marcus thought about the question, about all the answers he could give about the real truth underneath everything else. Because 5 years ago, I couldn't save my family. Maybe I can save you. Maybe that matters enough. The sun broke over the eastern horizon, washing them both in golden light, and Marcus saw Dawn's face in full clarity for the first time since she'd arrived. Saw the way tears tracked down her cheeks even as she stood straight and strong and refusing to break. Saw the moment something fundamental shifted inside her. Some decision made or surrendered or accepted. I will stay. If you want me to stay, I will stay. But not as payment. Not as debt. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, fierce, angry at herself for crying. I stay because I choose it. Because you see me like I'm a person, not a thing. I stay because maybe here I can be Dawn instead of all the other names I've been called. Marcus nodded, and the weight of that agreement settled between them like a foundation stone, something solid they could build on if they were careful, if they were patient, if they didn't let the world grind them down before they finished constructing whatever this was becoming. Then stay, as long as you want, as long as you need. They stood together in the morning light while the desert began its daily awakening around them. Two people damaged by different traumas, finding unlikely shelter in each other's orbit, and Marcus thought maybe Dakota had known exactly what he was doing. When he'd sent Dawn here, had seen something neither of them could see yet, but that might become visible if they just survived long enough to let it emerge. Winter settled over the high desert like a held breath, cold and waiting. The days after the bounty hunters left passed in careful routine. Dawn and Marcus moving around each other like dancers learning new steps, cautious of where their bodies occupied space, aware of proximity in ways that felt both comfortable and charged with something neither wanted to name yet. Dawn stopped sleeping outside after that first night, though she never took the bed, always arranging her blankets near the fireplace with the same precision she brought to everything else. She woke before Marcus every morning, but now she stayed inside until he rose boiling coffee in the battered pot he'd used alone for 5 years, the smell of it mixing with wood smoke in a way that made the cabin feel lived in for the first time since Sarah died. They worked the land together as December deepened toward January, repairing what 5 years of solitary neglect had allowed to decay, preparing for spring that felt impossibly distant under skies the color of old pewter. Dawn's strength made tasks Marcus had been putting off suddenly achievable. They reinforced the entire paddock fence in 3 days, replaced rotted support beams in the barn, cleared the irrigation ditch that had silted up over 2 seasons of disuse. She moved through physical labor with an economy that spoke of muscle memory, carved deep by years of practice. But Marcus noticed she never worked without purpose, never engaged in activity, just to stay busy the way he had for so long. Every task she chose addressed some concrete need, fixed some actual problem, as if frivolous effort was something she couldn't afford to waste. On the 8th night after the bounty hunters, Marcus pulled one of Sarah's books from the trunk, where he kept her things, a collection of poems she'd loved reading aloud by firelight back when the world had still held room for poetry. He opened it to a random page, began reading in the silence that had become their evening companion, and saw Dawn's head lift from where she sat mending one of his shirts with stitches small and precise as any seamstress. Her eyes tracked the book in his hands with an intensity that made him pause mid-line. "Do you read?" She shook her head slowly, something that might have been shame flickering across her face before she shuddered it away. Husband said reading was for men, for warriors and leaders, not for women who existed to work and breed. The casual cruelty in those words, delivered in Dawn's matter-of-fact tone, like she was reporting weather rather than abuse, made Marcus's jaw tighten. He closed the book, held it out toward her across the space between them. "Would you want to learn?" Dawn's hand stilled on the shirt she'd been mending, needle frozen mid-stitch. She looked at the book like it might transform into something dangerous. Then at Marcus's face, searching for mockery or trap, and finding neither. Her throat worked as she swallowed. "Women in my tribe don't read English. Some of the old ones read Apache, the symbols our grandmothers used, but white man's letters." She trailed off, pulled the needle through fabric, finished the stitch before looking up again. "If you teach me, I learn. If you have patience for stupid student." "You're not stupid. You rebuilt my barn in darkness with no plans or measurements. That takes intelligence most people don't have." Marcus moved to sit beside her on the floor near the fire, opened the book between them to the first page where large letters spelled out the title. "We'll start simple. Letters first, then sounds, then words." So began a ritual that filled their evenings. Dawn bent over the book with fierce concentration, while Marcus guided her through the alphabet, through the sounds each letter made, through the way letters combined into words that carried meaning beyond their individual components. She absorbed information like parched earth, drinking rain, asking questions that revealed a mind quick and hungry for knowledge it had been denied. Her fingers traced letters with the same reverence most people reserved for holy objects, and sometimes Marcus caught her whispering words to herself, while she worked during the day, practicing what they'd covered the night before, cementing the lessons through repetition. Within 2 weeks, she could read simple sentences. Within 3, she was working through children's primers. Marcus rode to town to purchase, ignoring the storekeeper's raised eyebrows when he asked for teaching materials. The town, a collection of weathered buildings called Socorro, clustered around a crossroads 40 miles east, represented the nearest human contact beyond each other, and Marcus made the trip every 2 weeks for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. He never asked if Dawn wanted to come, and she never offered, both understanding, without discussion, that her presence in town would raise questions neither wanted to answer, would draw attention that might bring more bounty hunters or worse. But on his 4th supply run in late January, Marcus returned to find Dawn standing in the yard with his rifle aimed at the road, her body coiled into that combat readiness he'd seen the morning the hunters came, and his heart kicked into faster rhythm before he processed what had changed. "What happened?" She lowered the rifle when she confirmed his identity, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. "Ryder came while you were gone. Apache from my old band. He stayed far out, didn't approach, just and left." She gestured toward the ridge where scrub brush marked the boundary of his property. "He knows I'm here." He was counting buildings, looking at defenses, studying the land. Marcus dismounted, began unloading supplies from his saddlebags while his mind worked through implications. A scout meant reconnaissance, meant someone planning something that required advanced knowledge of the terrain and Marcus's capabilities. Meant the tribe hadn't forgotten about Dawn, hadn't accepted her departure as permanent. "Did you recognize him?" Neshoba's youngest brother, 19 winters, eager to prove himself. Dawn followed Marcus into the cabin, set the rifle above the door with movements that suggested she was fighting not to keep it in her hands. "Neshoba leads the warriors who enforce tribal council decisions. If his brother was here, Neshoba sent him, which means council is discussing what to do about me." The name Neshoba hung in the air between them, and Marcus filed it away, as important someone whose actions would likely determine whether they faced more bounty hunters or something more official, more dangerous. He began shelving supplies while Dawn stood near the window, watching the empty ridge like the scout might reappear if she looked away. "Tell me about the council, how they make decisions, what they care about." So Dawn explained, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting history they'd lived rather than learned. The tribal council consisted of 7 elders, men who'd proven themselves as warriors and leaders who made decisions affecting the whole band's survival and social structure. They valued tradition, viewed deviation from established ways as threat to cohesion that kept Apache people alive in territory where white settlers and cavalry both wanted them dead or relocated. Widows occupied a complicated space in tribal hierarchy, too old or damaged to attract new husbands. They served as labor pool for tasks that required strength but commanded no status. Some tribal women held power as healers or wisdom keepers, but those roles required special knowledge or spiritual gifts. Dawn had been classified as pure labor, a body that could work but provided no other value, and her refusal to return to fulfill labor obligations constituted rebellion against council authority. "But I am not rebellion," Dawn said, still watching the ridge. "I am just trying to live without being owned. That is a different thing." Marcus thought about the distinction, about how the council probably couldn't see it that way, how any challenge to their authority threatened the system that kept them in power. He'd seen the same dynamic in cavalry command, the way officers punished insubordination, not because individual acts mattered, but because tolerating them eroded the structure that gave orders meaning. If they come for you, not bounty hunters, but actual tribal warriors, what happens? Dawn's reflection in the window glass showed her face settling into hard lines, jaw set against emotion. They take me back, or they kill me for refusing. Probably kill you for harboring me. Make examples so other widows don't get ideas about choosing their own paths. The matter-of-fact way she delivered that assessment made Marcus wonder how many times she'd run through these scenarios in her mind, how many nights she'd lain awake near his fire, calculating odds and outcomes, preparing herself for violence. She'd seen coming since the moment the old woman left her here. He wanted to offer reassurance that felt hollow. Even thinking it wanted to promise protection. He wasn't sure he could deliver against tribal warriors who'd grown up fighting for survival in terrain that killed white men through ignorance alone. Instead, he asked, "What do you want to do?" The question seemed to surprise her, made her turn from the window to look at him directly. "What I want doesn't matter. What comes will come. It matters to me. Your wants, I mean. They matter here." Marcus held her gaze. "So I'm asking, if you could choose any outcome, what would you choose?" Dawn's hands curled into fists at her sides, released, curled again, like she was physically restraining the urge to reach for something she believed she couldn't have. When she spoke, her voice came out smaller than usual, stripped of the armor she usually wrapped around vulnerable words. "I would choose to stay here, to keep learning to read, to keep fixing things that are broken, to keep waking up somewhere I am not afraid every moment." She paused, breath catching. "I would choose to become person I might have been if my life had been different. But that is wanting moon when you are standing in canyon. Impossible thing." Marcus crossed the room to stand beside her at the window, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Maybe. Or maybe we make it possible anyway. Fight for it if fighting is what it takes. You would fight my tribe for me." Disbelief colored her tone, mixed with something that might have been hope, trying to surface through layers of learned helplessness. "White men don't fight for Apache widows. White men barely fight for their own women. I'm not fighting for an Apache widow. I'm fighting for Dawn. There's a difference." She looked at him then with an expression that suggested she was seeing him clearly for the first time, really understanding that he meant what he said, that this wasn't charity or obligation, but choice. Her hand came up slowly, hesitantly touched his forearm with fingertips that trembled slightly before steadying. "Thank you for making me feel like I matter enough to fight for." They stood together at the window until the sun set and the ridge dissolved into darkness, and Marcus thought about Sarah and Emily, about the fact that he'd been 3 days away when they needed him most, about how maybe getting the chance to stand his ground for someone who needed protection represented a kind of redemption, even if he couldn't undo the past. That night, after Dawn had settled into her blankets and Marcus had banked the fire for sleeping, he lay awake listening to her breathe, and realized with start of recognition that the cabin no longer felt like a tomb he inhabited while waiting to die. Something had shifted in the weeks since she'd arrived, some fundamental change in the way space held life, and he understood with clarity that made his chest ache, that he'd been lonely for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to share air with another human being who saw him as more than obligation or memory. February came with storms that turned the desert white for 3 days before sun burned it back to red and brown, and in the enforced proximity of weather too harsh to work outside Marcus. And Dawn developed routines that felt simultaneously comfortable and charged with unspoken tension. She would read by firelight while he repaired tack or cleaned weapons, their silence punctuated by her occasional questions about words she didn't recognize, his explanations leading to conversations that spiraled into topics neither expected. She told him about growing up in a band that moved with seasons following game and water, avoiding cavalry patrols and hostile tribes with equal care. About learning to fight alongside boys because her size marked her as different from other girls, neither fully accepted by either group. About her mother dying in childbirth when Dawn was 12, leaving her in care of a father who saw her only as bargaining chip to secure alliance through marriage. Marcus shared pieces of his own history in return, the cavalry years that had seemed like adventure when he was 20, and revealed themselves as organized brutality by the time he was 30. The way he'd met Sarah at a fort social had fallen for her laugh, and the way she could talk about poetry and politics in the same breath had married her against her father's wishes, because officers didn't marry general store daughters. The perfect years before Emily was born, the even more perfect years after, the way he'd believed happiness was something you earned through right action rather than something you held carefully while knowing it could shatter any moment. I thought if I served honorably, if I followed orders, if I protected the people I was told to protect, then my family would be safe. He stared into the fire while Dawn sat motionless nearby, listening with the complete attention she brought to everything. But Sarah and Emily died anyway, and I learned that doing right doesn't protect you from wrong. It just makes you feel worse when wrong happens because you believed you'd prevented it. Dawn's voice came soft in the firelit darkness. I thought if I obeyed my husband, if I worked hard enough, if I made myself useful enough, he would stop hitting me. But he hit me anyway. And I learned that making yourself small doesn't make you safe. It just makes you smaller. The parallel in their experiences settled between them like recognition. Two people who'd learned the same lesson through different trauma, who'd survived by different means, but arrived at similar conclusions about how little control anyone really had over fate. Marcus felt something in his chest loosen fractionally, some tension he'd carried for 5 years, releasing its grip as he understood that Dawn really knew what it meant to fail at protecting what you loved most. They sat together until the fire burned low and sleep pulled at them both. And when Marcus finally stood to bank the coals, he paused beside where Dawn had arranged her blankets, looked down at her face painted in ember light, and felt the urge to say something that captured what her presence meant, what having another person in the cabin had done to the suffocating loneliness that had defined his existence since the raid. But words felt inadequate, so he just said, "Good night, Dawn." She smiled slightly, the expression transforming her face into something that wasn't quite beautiful, but carried its own compelling gravity. "Good night, Marcus." The spring began asserting itself in small ways, days stretching longer, temperature with extremes, moderating hints of green, appearing in sheltered areas where water collected. Marcus and Dawn prepared the vegetable plot Sarah had planted every year, turning soil that hadn't been worked in 5 seasons. And as his hands moved through dirt, Marcus realized he hadn't opened Emily's room since Dawn arrived, hadn't performed his weekly ritual of sitting inside surrounded by his daughter's things, while guilt ate him alive. The realization brought with it a species of panic, the feeling that by failing to punish himself appropriately, he was betraying Emily's memory, letting her fade from his mind the way bodies faded into earth. He stood abruptly from the garden, walked toward the cabin with Dawn calling after him in confusion, pushed through the door, and stood facing the locked room with his heart hammering against his ribs. His hands shook as he pulled the key from where it hung on a nail behind the stove, where Sarah had always kept the spare key, to rooms they needed to lock where it had remained untouched, except for his weekly pilgrimages into pain. The lock resisted rust and disuse, making it stick, but finally it turned, and the door swung inward on hinges that screamed protest. Emily's room looked exactly as it had the day she died, exactly as Marcus had preserved it, through 5 years of leaving everything untouched, like if he changed nothing, she might walk back through the door and ask for the doll she'd been holding when the raiders came. The doll sat on the bed now, its porcelain face cracked from the war club that had ended his daughter's life, and seeing it made Marcus's knees buckle. He sat down, hard on the floor, back against the doorframe, and the grief that he'd been holding at bay through work and routine and Dawn's presence crashed over him like a flash flood, sudden and total, incapable of sweeping away everything in its path. Sounds came out of his throat that didn't resemble language, something between sob and howl, and his hands pressed against his face like he could physically hold himself together through pressure alone. Dawn appeared in the doorway, took in the room with one sweeping glance that cataloged everything: the child-sized bed, the toys arranged on shelves, the dresses hanging on pegs, the doll with its shattered face, and her expression shifted into something that looked like she understood completely what this room represented, what opening it cost. She didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes or comfort, just sat down on the floor beside Marcus and wrapped one powerful arm around his shoulders, held him while he broke apart in a way he hadn't allowed himself to break in 5 years, because breaking required witness, and he'd had no one to witness him. Her strength supported his weight as he leaned into her, and her other hand found his where it clutched his knee, laced their fingers together with a grip that said she wasn't letting go, no matter how long this took. Time became meaningless, measured only in the gradual slowing of Marcus's breathing, the way his body stopped shaking by degrees, the eventual return of enough composure to lift his head and look at the room again without feeling like his chest was caving in. Dawn stayed beside him through it all, solid as bedrock, and when he finally could speak again, his voice came out raw as scraped metal. Her name was Emily. She was 6. She liked catching frogs at the creek and making me read the same bedtime story 5 times before she'd sleep. She could name every star in Orion, and she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up. The words tumbled out faster once they started, years of repression giving way to flood. Sarah tried to hide her when the raiders came. I found them both in here. The arrow in Sarah's throat killed her instantly. But Emily, he couldn't finish that sentence, couldn't give voice to what the physical evidence had told him about his daughter's final moments. Dawn's hand tightened on his. You loved them. That's what matters. That they were loved every day of their lives. I wasn't here to save them. The guilt that lived at the center of everything finally spoken aloud. I was 70 miles away chasing ghosts while they died alone and afraid. What kind of love is that? The kind that couldn't see the future. The kind that tried to protect by serving even when serving took you away. Dawn's voice carried conviction that suggested she'd fought similar battles with similar guilt. You think my husband's death was accident? I pushed him. Waited until he was drunk enough that he couldn't catch himself. Waited until we were near a cliff, then I pushed him and watched him fall. She paused, breathing hard like confession cost her something vital. I killed him because staying meant eventually he would kill me. But I still wake up thinking, maybe I am murderer. Maybe tribe is right to treat me like cursed thing. Marcus turned to look at her fully, saw the tears tracking down her face, saw the way her jaw set against them like she could will herself to stop feeling what she felt. Her admission hung between them, heavy with implications, and he understood she just trusted him with something she'd never told anyone else, had given him power to condemn her if he chose. You survived. That's not murder. That's self-defense. He echoed the words she'd said to him about his family's death, gave them back to her like medicine. And I don't think you're cursed. I think you were trapped and you found a way out. That makes you strong, not broken. She shook her head, not in denial, but in something more complicated, an expression that said she wanted to believe him, but didn't quite know how. We are both haunted, Marcus Stone, both carrying ghosts that tell us we don't deserve to live. Maybe that's why Dakota sent me here. Not to pay debt, but because we are same kind of broken, the kind that understands each other. Marcus thought about that, about the way they'd moved around each other these past months, careful of invisible wounds, recognizing pain in each other that most people couldn't see. He looked back into Emily's room at the preserved evidence of a life cut short, at the way he'd turned this space into a shrine that demanded his suffering and as tribute. I don't want to live like this anymore. Don't want to keep punishing myself by sitting in here every week remembering everything I lost. The words felt like tearing something out of his chest, necessary but agonizing. But I don't know how to let go without feeling like I'm abandoning her. Dawn stood, pulled him up with her, walked into Emily's room and picked up the doll from the bed. She examined its cracked face for a long moment, then carried it back to where Marcus stood frozen in the doorway. This doll, Emily loved it. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. Then we keep it. Put it somewhere you see every day. So Emily lives in the house, not locked away in room you only visit to hurt yourself. Dawn held the doll out to him. Memory should make you stronger, not weaker. This is how my people think about our dead. They travel with us, not behind locked doors. The simple logic in her words, cut through 5 years of self-imposed torture, offered a path Marcus hadn't been able to see while drowning in guilt. He took the doll, cradled it like he cradled Emily when she was small enough to hold, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight since the raid finally loosened its grip. Together they left the room. Marcus placed the doll on the mantel above the fireplace where he would see it every day, where Emily would be present in the space he lived rather than segregated in a room he only entered to bleed. Dawn stood beside him, her hand finding his shoulder, and they looked at the doll together in silence that felt like shared understanding. "Thank you," Marcus finally said, "for this, for being here, for understanding what this room meant. You gave me name I chose for myself. You taught me to read. You see me like I am person worth protecting." Dawn's voice carried weight of emotion she rarely showed. "This is nothing compared to that. This is just being friend to someone who needed friend." Friend. The words settled over them, both accurate, but somehow insufficient for what had developed between them, the way their lives had become entangled through proximity and shared damage, and the slow building of trust between people who'd both learned not to trust. Marcus turned to face her fully, saw his own complex emotions reflected in her dark eyes, saw the moment awareness shifted between them into something neither had been ready to acknowledge until now. The space between them felt charged, pregnant with possibility, and Marcus found himself noticing details. He'd been carefully not noticing the way firelight played across her skin, the strength in her frame that no longer registered as threat, but as something else entirely, the fact that her lips had parted slightly as she looked at him like she was seeing something new. His hand came up without conscious decision, touched her face with fingertips that trembled, traced the line of her jaw with touch so light it barely qualified as contact. Dawn's eyes closed at the touch, her breath catching, and when they opened again, something in her expression had shifted from careful distance into tentative hope. Her hand covered his where it rested against her face, held it there, like she was afraid he'd pull away. "Marcus, she stopped started again. "I don't know how to do this, how to want someone without fear. My husband made wanting painful, made closeness into trap. We don't have to do anything, don't have to figure this out tonight." But even as he said it, Marcus knew they'd crossed some invisible line, had acknowledged something that couldn't be unacknowledged. "We just keep living, keep being here together. Let the rest happen as it happens." Dawn nodded slowly, but she didn't let go of his hand, and they stood like that in the firelight with Emily's doll watching from the mantel and the locked room standing open for the first time in 5 years, two people finding their way towards something that resembled healing, maybe even towards something that resembled hope. Outside, night wind moved through the desert, carrying the promise of spring, and inside the cabin that had been tombed for so long, life began remembering how to grow again. March bled into April, and April surrendered to May, and with the passing months, the thing between Marcus and Dawn that neither could name grew roots deeper than either intended. They moved around each other with increasing awareness of proximity, hands brushing when passing tools, shoulders touching when sitting by the fire to read glances held a beat too long before one or both looked away. The tension built like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon, visible, but not yet arrived, inevitable, but still avoidable if they chose not to acknowledge what they both felt developing. Dawn's body began to change in subtle ways that Marcus tried not to notice, but couldn't help cataloging muscles that had been hard from defensive tension, softening fractionally, the rigid set of her shoulders easing into something approaching relaxation, her face losing some of the haunted wariness that had defined her expression when she first arrived. She smiled more small expressions that transformed her features into something Marcus found himself watching for, working to earn through small kindnesses or observations that made her laugh. Her laugh was rare enough to feel like gift when it emerged, a sound rough from years of disuse but genuine in its brightness, and Marcus discovered he would say almost anything to hear it. He told her stories from his cavalry days, the absurd ones rather than the violent ones, about horses that refused to be ridden and officers who got lost on routine patrols, and the time an entire platoon got drunk on confiscated whiskey and serenaded the fort commander at 3 in the morning. Dawn would listen with an expression of delighted disbelief, like she couldn't quite accept that white soldiers behaved as foolishly as everyone else. And when the laughter finally broke free, Marcus felt something in his chest expand to accommodate the joy of making her happy. They planted the garden together in late April, working the soil that hadn't produced vegetables in 5 years. And as they moved down rows with seeds and careful spacing, Marcus found himself imagining harvest in late summer, imagining the two of them working together to bring in tomatoes and squash and beans, imagining a future that extended beyond the next day or week into something that resembled permanence. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure, the prospect of building something with another person after 5 years of deliberate isolation. One evening in early May, as they sat by the fire with Dawn, bent over one of Sarah's novels, she'd graduated from primers to actual literature in the months since January, Marcus watched the way firelight played across her profile and felt the truth settle over him with the weight of recognition. He'd fallen for her, somewhere between teaching her to read and watching her rebuild his life alongside her own, somewhere between shared grief in Emily's room and the daily thousand small kindnesses they exchanged without thinking he'd fallen completely. The realization brought with it complicated tangle of emotions, guilt that he could feel this way about someone who wasn't Sarah, fear that acknowledging these feelings would somehow doom them, the way his previous happiness had been doomed, wonder that someone as damaged as he was could still experience something as fundamental as desire. He sat with the knowledge pressing against his ribs, while Dawn read oblivious to his internal crisis, and tried to determine what he was supposed to do with emotions he hadn't asked for and didn't know how to handle. Dawn looked up from her book, caught his stare, and her expression shifted into something between curiosity and concern. "Why you look at me like that?" Marcus's mouth went dry, all the careful words he'd been constructing evaporating under the directness of her attention. He opened his mouth to deflect, to make some excuse about being lost in thought, but what came out instead was raw honesty. "I was thinking about how much my life has changed since you came here. How much better it is." She set the book aside slowly, her eyes never leaving his face, reading something in his expression that made her own face soften. "Better how? Every way. I don't wake up hoping I won't wake up. I don't spend every night sitting in a locked room punishing myself for surviving. I eat real meals instead of whatever requires least effort. I—" He paused, gathered courage. "I remember what it feels like to want tomorrow to come." Dawn's breath caught audibly, and in the firelight he could see the pulse hammering in her throat, betraying agitation her face didn't show. She shifted on the floor, moving closer to where he sat, close enough that their knees nearly touched, close enough that he could feel warmth radiating from her body. "For me too. Everything different." Her voice came quieter than usual, shaped by emotion she didn't bother hiding. "I don't wake up afraid every moment. Don't feel like I have to earn right to breathe. Don't think about dying every day anymore." She paused, her hand coming up to touch her chest where her heart beat. "You make me feel like I could be someone. Not just thing that survives, but person who lives." The space between them felt charged with possibility, with the weight of things unsaid but deeply felt, and Marcus found himself leaning forward, fractionally drawn by gravity he couldn't resist. Dawn's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull back, and he saw her lips part as her breathing quickened. "Dawn, I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, she spoke, words tumbling out like she'd been holding them back too long. "It's been so long since I've been near a man without fear. So long since I wanted—" She stopped, color rising in her face. "Since my husband died, I thought that part of me died too. The part that wants closeness. But it didn't die. It was just waiting." Marcus's heart slammed against his ribs hard enough to hurt. "Waiting for what? For someone safe. Someone who sees me." Her hand reached out, tentative, touched his face the way he'd touched hers months ago in this same spot. "For you." He covered her hand with his, held it against his face, felt the calluses on her palm that spoke of labor and survival and strength. Every rational part of his mind screamed warnings about moving too fast, about the complications this would create, about the fact that tribal warriors might come for her any day, and intimacy would only make loss more devastating. But the part of him that had been alone for 5 years, that had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted and to want in return drowned out rationality with need. "I'm terrified," he admitted, voice rough. "Everyone I've wanted, I've lost. Everyone I've loved, I couldn't protect. And the thought of caring about you, this much of you mattering this much, scares me more than anything I faced in the cavalry." Don's other hand found his chest pressed flat over his heart where it hammered. "I'm terrified, too, of wanting, of trusting, of letting someone close enough to hurt me." Her eyes met his with intensity that felt like standing in direct sunlight. "But I choose to risk it anyway, because living afraid is not living, is just waiting to die." The truth in her words resonated through Marcus's entire body, shook loose the last of his resistance, and he closed the remaining distance between them. His lips found hers with a gentleness that belied the desperation he felt, and she responded with equal care, as if they were both afraid of breaking something fragile. The kiss lasted only seconds before they pulled apart foreheads, touching, breathing each other's air. "Are you sure?" Marcus's hands framed her face, thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "I need you to be sure." "I'm sure." No hesitation in her voice, no doubt in her eyes. "I choose this. I choose you. Not because I owe you, not because I have nowhere else. Because I want you." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and she made a sound low in her throat that went straight to his core. Her arms wrapped around him with strength that could have crushed him if she chose, pulled him closer, until no space remained between them, and Marcus felt 5 years of grief and isolation crack open to make room for something new, something terrifying and necessary and achingly beautiful. They moved together toward his bed, the bed he'd slept alone in for so long, and what followed was clumsy and intense and profoundly meaningful in ways that had nothing to do with physical mechanics and everything to do with two damaged people choosing vulnerability over safety, choosing each other over fear. Dawn's hands shook when she touched him, and his shook when he touched her, both of them unpracticed at gentleness, at intimacy without pain attached. But they learned together slowly, patiently, with whispered reassurances and careful attention to what made the other gasp or sigh or pull them closer. Afterward, they lay tangled together while the fire burned low, and Marcus felt something settle in his chest that he eventually identified as peace. Dawn's head rested on his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck, one powerful arm draped across his ribs like she was anchoring him to earth. He stroked her hair with slow, reverent touches and tried to remember the last time he had felt this complete. "I was thinking," Dawn's voice rumbled against his skin, "that maybe this is what Dakota meant. When he talked about debt being paid, not me serving you, but both of us saving each other." Marcus considered that the idea that the old man had seen something neither of them could see at the time, had understood that they needed each other in ways that transcended tribal obligation or life debt. "Maybe, or maybe we just got lucky. Apache don't believe in luck, only in signs." She propped herself up on one elbow, looked down at him with an expression so open it made his chest ache. "You are my sign that life can be different, that I can choose my path." He pulled her back down, kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. "Then we choose each other. Every day. Whatever comes." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, like they could keep the world at bay through proximity alone. And Marcus's last conscious thought was that if happiness was always temporary, at least he'd had this night, this moment, this woman choosing him, despite every reason to choose safety instead. Morning arrived too soon, sunlight streaming through the window to paint everything gold. And Marcus woke to find Dawn already awake, watching him with an expression that combined tenderness and uncertainty in equal measure. He touched her face, traced the line of her jaw, tried to communicate without words that nothing had changed except everything had changed. "Do you regret it?" Her voice carried vulnerability he'd rarely heard from her, the fear that intimacy had been mistake. "No, never." He kissed her to prove it. "Do you?" She shook her head, but shadows moved behind her eyes that suggested complications she was working through. "I don't regret, but I'm afraid. Afraid that now I have something precious, something will come to take it away. That's how my life has always worked. The few times I had something good, it was taken." Marcus understood that fear intimately lived with its twin every day since Sarah and Emily died. Then we protect what we have. Fight for it if we have to, but we don't let fear make our choices for us. They rose and dressed, moved through morning routine with new awareness of each other. hands finding reasons to touch in passing eyes, meeting and holding more often than necessary. Marcus made coffee while Dawn rekindled the fire, and the domestic normalcy of it all felt surreal after the intensity of the previous night, like they were playing at being a couple without knowing if they'd earned that right. The peace lasted until mid-morning when Dawn's body went rigid at the window, where she'd been reading her book falling closed as her hands gripped the sill hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Marcus looked up from the leather he'd been working on, saw the tension in her frame, grabbed his rifle on instinct. How many? 5 riders. Coming slow. Apache. Her voice carried the flatness of forced calm. Neshoba leads them. I recognize his horse. Marcus joined her at the window, saw the 5 warriors picking their way through the scrub at a pace that suggested they weren't attacking, but weren't friendly either. The leader sat his painted pony with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent his life on horseback, and even at distance, Marcus could make out the lightning bolt scar that marked the left side of his face, distinctive enough that he'd be recognizable anywhere. What does he want? To bring me back, or to kill me for refusing? Dawn stepped away from the window, began checking weapons with practiced efficiency, her hands moving on autopilot while her face remained expressionless. Council sent him 6 months ago. He sent his brother to scout 2 months ago. Now he comes himself to finish it. But when the 5 riders stopped at the property line and Neshoba dismounted alone, approaching with his hands visible and empty, Marcus realized this might not be the confrontation Dawn expected. The warrior stopped 20 feet from the porch, his face impassive, but his eyes scanning the homestead with what looked like assessment rather than hostility. Marcus Stone, the widow Dawn, I come to talk. Only talk. His English came clearer than Dawn's had when she arrived, shaped by someone who'd learned young. May I approach? Marcus kept his rifle ready, but not aimed. You can talk from there. Neshoba nodded, accepting the terms. Council sends me to return Dawn to her duties. They say she brings shame by refusing to serve, that other widows see her absence and think about their own choices. He paused and something shifted in his expression. But I did not come to force her back. I came to warn her. Dawn emerged onto the porch, positioned herself beside Marcus with her own weapon held ready. Warn me about what? Hanska, the council elder who leads the traditional faction. He gathers warriors who agree with him, young men angry about losing old ways, who see your defiance as threat to everything they know. Neshoba's jaw tightened. He plans to come for you in 4 days, with enough men to overwhelm any defense you mount. Not to take you back, but to make example, to kill you and anyone who protects you. The words fell like stones into still water, ripples spreading to touch everything they reached. Marcus felt Dawn go rigid beside him, felt his own body flood with adrenaline that sharpened the world into hyperclarity. 4 days. Enough time to run, but not enough time to truly prepare. Not enough time to gather help, even if help existed. Why warn us? Marcus's finger moved to his rifle's trigger guard, not trusting this sudden ally. Why betray your own counsel? Because my sister was widow like Dawn, treated like property, sent to repay debt to man who beat her worse than her first husband. She died trying to escape. Neshoba's face showed the first crack in his composure, grief flashing through before he controlled it. Council called it accident, said she fell while running away, but I saw her body, saw the marks that said someone made sure she didn't escape, and I've been angry ever since. Dawn's breath caught beside Marcus', recognition in her voice. Kim Imela, I knew her. She was my friend. She spoke of you before she died, said you were strongest woman in the band, said if anyone could break free, it would be you. Neshoba met Dawn's eyes across the distance. I want the old ways to change. Want widows to have choice. Want women treated like people, not property. But I can't change things alone. Need others who feel same way. And first I need you to survive what's coming. Marcus processed the implications, the fact that this tribal warrior was offering alliance against his own people, risking his position and maybe his life to support a woman most of his band considered traitor. The cynic in him, forged by years of broken promises and betrayed trust, wanted to dismiss this as trap. But the desperation in Neshoba's voice rang true, and Dawn's recognition of the dead sister suggested this man had reason to want change. What do you suggest we do? Marcus lowered his rifle fractionally, showing willingness to talk even if trust remained distant. 5 of us can't hold against war party if they're determined. Not 5, 12. Neshoba gestured back toward the 4 warriors who waited with the horses. These men follow me. Agree with me about widows, about old ways needing change. There are others in the band who think same way, younger men and women who see how council treats people they declare worthless. He paused. We need you to live Dawn. Need you to be symbol of what's possible. But you'll have to fight for it. Dawn stepped forward, her weapon lowered, now her face showing the internal battle between hope and learned wariness. If I fight, people die. Apache people, maybe you, maybe people who follow you. That's blood on my hands. Blood is already on Council's hands. Kimimela's blood. Blood of other widows who died rather than serve. Blood of any woman who stepped outside what Council declared proper. Neshoba's voice carried intensity that spoke of long, simmering rage finally finding outlet. You don't create violence by defending yourself. You just refuse to be its victim anymore. The logic resonated with something in Marcus's chest, the understanding that sometimes fighting back was the only moral choice, even if fighting meant casualties. He'd spent 5 years blaming himself for not being present when Sarah and Emily needed him, for failing to prevent violence through absence. Maybe this time he could be present, could stand ground, could protect someone who mattered, instead of arriving too late to matter at all. He looked at Dawn, saw the conflict in her face, the way she was calculating costs and benefits and probabilities. Her eyes found his asking silent question, and he gave silent answer by nodding once. Whatever she chose, he would stand with her. Dawn turned back to Neshoba, her shoulders straightening like she was preparing to carry weight that would break most people. 4 days, that's when Hanska comes. At dawn, he wants to catch you sleeping, wants easy victory with minimal resistance. Neshoba's hand moved to rest on the knife at his belt, unconscious gesture that suggested he was already mentally preparing for combat. We can be here waiting, can turn his easy victory into fight he doesn't expect. And after, if we win, Dawn's voice carried skepticism that suggested she didn't believe winning was possible. What then? Council is still council. Hanska or someone like him is still in power. Then we split the band, take everyone who wants change and create new band. It's been done before when councils became too rigid, when old ways started killing the people they were supposed to protect. Neshoba met her gaze steadily. We remake our world into something better. Or we die trying. Those are only choices left. The starkness of that assessment hung in the air between them, and Marcus thought about the fact that Dawn had found her way to his homestead through Takota's death, had found freedom through defying expectations, had found love through choosing risk over safety. Maybe this was the next logical step in that journey, the moment where she stopped running from her past and turned to face it directly on her terms, with people who believed she deserved the right to choose. Before Dawn could respond, movement at the tree line caught Marcus's attention, a flash of color that resolved into a figure running toward them with the desperation of someone fleeing threat. Female Apache, smaller than Dawn but moving with similar efficiency, and as she got closer, Marcus saw Dawn's body go rigid with recognition. Kimimela, Dawn's voice emerged strangled. But Neshoba said, I lied. The warrior's face showed something between shame and relief. Council announced she died, but I helped her escape. Sent her to live with Mexican family 50 miles south. She's been safe there, until yesterday when she heard about Hanska's plan and rode to find you. Kimimela reached them, breathing hard, her face streaked with dust and sweat, her eyes wild with urgency. She grabbed Dawn's arms, words spilling out in rapid Apache that Marcus couldn't follow, but Dawn's face went pale as she listened. Finally, Kimimela switched to broken English for Marcus's benefit. Hanska not coming in 4 days. That was lied to make you feel safe. He comes tonight. Now. Maybe hour behind me. She looked between Dawn and Marcus and Neshoba. He has 16 warriors, young men who want to prove themselves by killing white man and traitor widow. They're coming to burn this place with you inside it. The world seemed to stop for a heartbeat, Onoba's sound dropping away except Marcus's own pulse hammering in his ears. Tonight, not 4 days, but hours, maybe less, and their force of 12 against 16 warriors who'd grown up fighting in terrain that Marcus barely understood. The odds were bad, possibly insurmountable, and the smart choice was to run mount horses and ride south toward the Mexican border and hope they could outpace pursuit. He looked at Dawn, saw her looking at the cabin they'd shared for months, at the garden they'd planted together, at the life they'd started building from ruins of their separate traumas. Saw the moment her face hardened into decision, jaw setting with determination that said running was off the table. "We stand." Her voice cut through the silence like blade through flesh. "I'm done running from people who think they own me. Done letting others decide I'm not worth fighting for." She turned to Marcus, her eyes fierce with something that might have been rage, or might have been love, or might have been both mixed together until they became indistinguishable. "I stay and fight. You should run. You've done enough, more than enough. You don't owe me your life." Marcus felt something crystallize in his chest, clarity cutting through fear to reveal bedrock truth. He'd been given second chance. He didn't think he deserved opportunity to stand his ground for someone who mattered. Moment to prove that sometimes you could save what you loved if you refused to abandon it. Walking away now would mean living the rest of his life knowing he'd run when it mattered most, would mean betraying not just Dawn, but the person he wanted to be. "I'm not running. This is my land. You're my—" He paused, searched for word that captured what she'd become to him. "You're mine to protect. Ours to protect. We stand together or not at all." Dawn's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, and she gripped his hand hard enough to hurt. "Then we fight. And maybe we die, but at least we die choosing." Neshoba barked orders in Apache to the 4 warriors who'd ridden with him, and they scattered to positions around the property, taking defensive stances that suggested this wasn't their first battle. Kimimela pulled a knife from her belt, checked its edge, her face settling into grim determination that made her look like Dawn's younger sister, same strength in smaller frame. "I fight too. For you. For me. For all the women council treats like animals." Her English was rougher than Dawn's, but no less certain. "We win or die, but we fight." Marcus's military training kicked in, cavalry years of defensive strategy flooding back. "Neshoba, how good are your bowmen?" "Best in the band." "Why, yeah, because we turned this homestead into fortress." "Barricade the cabin position shooters on the barn roof where they have height advantage, create crossfire zones they have to enter to reach us." He pointed to the paddock fence. "We take down sections of fence, use the wood to block windows, and reinforce walls. Make them pay for every foot they try to advance." They had less than an hour, maybe less, and they used every minute. The warriors Neshoba commanded proved their worth immediately, moving with practiced efficiency to execute Marcus's defensive plan. Fence sections came down and were rapidly nailed across cabin windows, leaving only narrow firing ports. 2 bowmen scaled the barn roof, taking positions that gave them overlapping fields of fire. Kimimela helped Dawn move anything flammable away from the cabin's exterior walls, reducing fire risk. Marcus checked weapons, loaded every gun they had, distributed ammunition. 6 rifles, his old cavalry saber, various knives and hand weapons, and Neshoba's bow, plus the traditional Apache weapons his warriors carried. 12 defenders against 16 attackers was still bad odds, but fortified position an element of surprise. Hanska expecting sleeping targets instead of prepared defense might even things out. As sun began its western descent, painting everything in shades of gold and red that felt inappropriately beautiful, given what was coming, Marcus found himself standing beside Dawn on the porch, looking at the land they'd worked together, the life they'd begun building. Her hand found his, lacing their fingers together. "I'm glad I came here. Glad Dakota sent me to you. Even if tonight is end, I'm glad I had these months." Her voice carried peace that seemed impossible given circumstances. "For first time in my life, I got to choose. Got to be loved for who I am, not what I could do for others. That's worth fighting for. Worth dying for." Marcus pulled her close, kissed her with all the intensity of someone who knew this might be their last private moment. "We're not dying tonight. We're surviving, together. And tomorrow we'll plant more garden and teach you to read something even harder and argue about whose turn it is to cook dinner. That's the future I'm fighting for." She smiled against his mouth, fierce and beautiful and unbreakable. "Then let's live long enough to see it." The attack came as the sun touched the horizon, 16 warriors emerging from the desert like shadows given form, moving with coordination that spoke of planned assault. Hanska led them, an older warrior with gray in his hair and murder in his eyes, his voice carrying across the distance as he called out demands in Apache that needed no translation. Neshoba shouted response from his position on the barn, words that made Hanska's face contort with rage, and then the first arrows flew. The defense Marcus had orchestrated held bowmen on the roof picking off exposed attackers, while riflemen in the cabin fired through ports that gave them cover. 3 warriors went down in the first exchange, not dead but wounded enough to withdraw, and Hanska's force learned quickly that easy victory they'd expected had transformed into costly siege. The battle evolved into brutal close-quarters fighting as Hanska's warriors realized they couldn't win with ranged weapons, had to close distance to overwhelm defenders through numbers. They rushed the cabin in waves, and Marcus found himself defending the door with cavalry saber in hand, cutting and blocking with muscle memory from years that felt like lifetime ago. Dawn fought beside him with knife and her own terrifying strength, grappling warriors who tried to force entry and throwing them back like they weighed nothing. Blood spattered the porch wood. Men screamed in pain and rage. Somewhere in the chaos, Marcus heard Kimimela's war cry as she defended the cabin's rear entrance, heard Neshoba's shouts coordinating defenders, heard the thunderous report of rifle fire mixing with the whistle of arrows. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing randomly, and Marcus operated on pure instinct, his conscious mind shutting down to let training take over. He saw Hanska break through on the cabin's east side, saw the older warrior charging toward Dawn with war club raised, and Marcus threw himself between them. The club that would have caved in Dawn's skull caught him on the shoulder, instead sending lightning bolt agony down his arm and knocking him to his knees. Dawn roared something in Apache that sounded like curse and prayer combined, caught Hanska's neck swing with her bare hand, twisted the club from his grip, despite the impact breaking 2 of her fingers. What followed happened too fast for Marcus's pain-fogged brain to fully process. Dawn and Hanska grappled strength against experienced younger fighter, against older warrior, who'd survived decades of combat. They crashed through cabin wall that had already been damaged, sending wooden planks flying, rolling through the wreckage, while throwing strikes that would have killed lesser opponents. Marcus struggled to his feet, his left arm hanging. Neshoba appear from somewhere, saw the younger warrior's face as he watched his council elder and the widow fight for their lives. Saw the moment decision crystallized, saw Neshoba move to help. Not Hanska, but Dawn, saw him block another warrior who tried to interfere, creating space for Dawn to finish what she'd started. She did. Hanska's neck broke with a sound like dry branch snapping, and then he went limp in Dawn's arms. She held him for a moment, this man who'd declared her worthless, who'd sent warriors to kill her, and her face showed no triumph, only exhaustion and sorrow for violence that shouldn't have been necessary. The remaining attackers saw their leader fall, and their resolve shattered. Some ran immediately, others hesitated, until Neshoba shouted something in Apache that made them drop their weapons. Within minutes, it was over, the yard littered with wounded and dead, the cabin damaged, but standing defenders, bloodied but alive. Marcus counted casualties through vision that kept graying at the edges. 2 of Neshoba's warriors dead, 3 more wounded but survivable. Kimimela injured but mobile. Dawn standing over Hanska's corpse with her broken hand cradled against her chest. Himself with shoulder that wouldn't work properly and possibly broken ribs from impact he didn't remember taking. Dawn crossed to him, helped him sit before his legs gave out, her good hand cradling his face with gentleness that contrasted violently with the blood covering her clothes. "You're hurt, let me see." "I'm alive. We're alive." He managed a pained smile. "That's what matters." Neshoba approached, his lightning bolt scar standing out stark against skin gone pale. "Hanska is dead. Council will have to acknowledge this. We'll have to accept that old ways died here tonight." He looked at the warriors who'd surrendered then at dawn. "You won your freedom. Really won it. No one can take it now." But Dawn was staring past him toward the ridge where dust rose against the darkening sky, more riders approaching, and Marcus felt his heart sink, because they'd survived one battle only to face another, and this time they had no strength left to mount defense. Then Kimimela laughed, bright sound utterly out of place in the carnage, and pointed. "Look, those are our people. Young women and their families who waited to see if you'd survive. They're coming to join us." The riders resolved into 24 Apache, mostly women and children, with a handful of younger men, approaching with peace signs raised. They'd been watching from distance, Neshoba explained, waiting to see if resistance succeeded before committing themselves. Now they came to align with the faction that had fought for change, came to be part of whatever emerged from tonight's bloodshed. Marcus watched them arrive, watched Dawn greet women who'd been her friends when she was still. Yanya watched Neshoba begin organizing people into something that looked like new band, forming from fragments of old. He felt Dawn's good hand find his felt her lean against him, despite her own injuries, and understood they'd done something tonight that went beyond personal survival. They'd broken a system, killed the leader of oppression, and lived to tell about it. Created possibility for others to choose their own paths. The cost had been high. Bodies cooling in the yard testified to them but sometimes cost was worth paying if it meant futures built on choice rather than compulsion. Come inside. Dawn's voice pulled him from thoughts that threatened to spiral. Let me tend your shoulder. Then we figure out what happens next. They limped into cabin that smelled of gunpowder and blood, and Marcus thought about how 12 hours ago they'd been wrapped around each other in bed, choosing intimacy over fear, and now they were choosing survival over surrender. And maybe those choices were connected. Maybe learning to want life again meant being willing to fight for it when death came calling. Outside, Neshoba's voice raised in Apache, beginning to organize the refugees, starting to build structure for band that would operate on different principles than the one they'd left. Inside, Dawn cleaned Marcus's wounds with hands that trembled from exhaustion and broken fingers. And he did the same for her two people who'd survived what should have killed them, figuring out how to keep living now that dying was off the table. The weeks following the battle passed in strange twilight between recovery and reconstruction. Marcus's shoulder healed slowly, mobility returning in increments, measured by how high he could lift his arm each morning, how many chores he could complete before pain forced him to stop. Dawn's broken fingers required splinting, 2 weeks of enforced gentleness from a woman whose strength had defined her survival, and watching her struggle with tasks that had come easily before made Marcus's chest ache with protective instinct he couldn't act on without insulting her independence. Neshoba's new band, they called themselves the Free People in English, though the Apache name carried nuances that didn't translate. Cleanly established temporary camp on Marcus's land, with his permission, 28 souls who'd chosen change over tradition. They erected traditional shelters at the property's northern edge, far enough from the cabin to provide privacy but close enough to coordinate defense if more threats emerged. The arrangement felt temporary and permanent simultaneously, like they were all waiting for the other shoe to drop, while simultaneously building something meant to last. The original band sent no more warriors, no delegations demanding return of their lost members. Silence stretched for 3 weeks, then 4, and Neshoba interpreted this as reluctant acceptance rather than gathering storm. The council had lost their most aggressive enforcer in Hanska, and the younger warriors who'd survived the battle carried stories back about resistance they'd faced, about Dawn's strength and Marcus's willingness to kill for someone he'd claimed as his own. Fear was useful tool. Sometimes Marcus reflected better than open warfare if it prevented future bloodshed. But the silence felt fragile, liable to shatter if the wrong pressure was applied, and Marcus found himself checking the horizon more often than necessary, rifle always within arm's reach. Part of him still braced for attack that might never come. Dawn noticed caught him staring toward the ridge one afternoon while she was reading on the porch, her splinted hand resting on the book to hold pages open. You think they come back? Not question, but observation. I think people don't change quickly. I think the council might decide accepting this sets bad precedent, that other bands might hear about it and get ideas about defying their own leaders. Marcus sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. I think we won the battle, but the war isn't over. She closed the book, used her good hand to take his. War might never be over. People like council, like Hanska, they exist everywhere. In tribes, in white towns, in cavalry forts. People who need to control others to feel powerful. Her thumb stroked across his knuckles. We can't stop all of them, just the ones who come for us directly. The pragmatism in her voice reminded Marcus why he'd fallen for her, the way she saw clearly without illusions but didn't let harsh reality crush her capacity for hope. She'd survived worse than council warriors and emerged intact, had learned to read and trust and love, despite everything that should have destroyed those abilities, and watching her adapt to the hand fate dealt her made Marcus believe they might actually survive what was coming. June arrived with heat that turned the desert into furnace, and the Free People helped Marcus and Dawn expand the irrigation system to support both the vegetable garden and new crops they planted to feed increased population. Working alongside Apache women who'd spent their lives laboring without recognition, Marcus saw how Dawn fit into their community, how they looked to her, not as leader, but as symbol of what Defiance made possible. She deflected their reverence with characteristic directness, insisted she was just woman who'd gotten lucky. But Marcus noticed the young girls watching her with expressions that suggested they were mentally measuring themselves against her frame, wondering if they too could be strong enough to choose their own paths. Kimimela took on role as bridge between Marcus and the free people, her English better than most, and her friendship with Dawn predating the current crisis. She explained Apache customs Marcus didn't understand, helped him navigate cultural differences that could have created unnecessary friction, and in return, he taught her to shoot rifle with accuracy that made Neshoba shake his head in mock dismay that his sister, who wasn't dead, was becoming better marksman than him. "You have gift for teaching," Kimimela observed one afternoon after putting 6 shots in palm-sized group at 50 yards. "Maybe you teach others. Young ones need to know how to defend themselves, but traditional weapons only go so far against white men with guns." The suggestion made Marcus uncomfortable initially, the idea of arming Apache youth with knowledge that could be used against cavalry or settlers. But Dawn's voice in his head reminded him that these weren't his enemies anymore, that drawing lines between people based on ancestry was what had created this situation in the first place. So he agreed, started holding shooting lessons for any free people who wanted to learn, and found unexpected satisfaction in watching students improve and knowing he was contributing something useful beyond just the land his cabin occupied. Days blended into routine that felt almost normal, and Marcus caught himself thinking about future in terms of seasons rather than days, what they'd plant next spring, how they'd winterize the expanded settlement, whether they should add another room to the cabin for storage, or maybe something else. The thought of something else had been occurring with increasing frequency, usually when he watched Dawn with the Free People's children, the way she'd crouch down to their level and speak in Apache, soft enough that Marcus couldn't hear the way they'd climb on her, like she was living mountain, and laugh when she lifted them high overhead with her good hand. He'd catch her looking at the children with expression he couldn't quite read, something between longing and fear, and he wanted to ask what she was thinking, but didn't know how to frame the question without making assumptions about what she wanted from life now that choosing was option. They'd never discussed future beyond survival. Never talked about whether this thing between them was temporary comfort or foundation for building something permanent, and the uncertainty sat in Marcus's chest like stone he couldn't dislodge. It was late June, 6 weeks after the battle, when everything shifted. Marcus woke before dawn to find Dawn's side of the bed empty, not unusual since she often rose early, but something in the quality of silence felt wrong. He found her outside, sitting on the porch steps with her face turned toward the eastern horizon, where stars were just beginning to fade, and even in pre-dawn darkness, he could see the tension in her shoulders that suggested she'd been sitting there a while. "Can't sleep." He lowered himself beside her, his shoulder protesting the movement, but functional enough now that he'd stopped thinking about it constantly. She didn't answer immediately, and when she did, her voice carried weight that made his stomach clench with premonition. "Marcus, I need to tell you something, and I'm afraid." Fear lanced through him, immediate certainty that she was leaving, that she'd decided life here wasn't what she wanted, that everything they'd built would dissolve because he'd let himself hope again. His hands curled into fists against his thighs, bracing for impact. "Tell me." Dawn's good hand moved to rest on her stomach, flat against the buckskin dress she wore, and the gesture was so subtle Marcus almost missed it. But once he saw it, everything else clicked into place. The way she'd been eating less lately, the fatigue that made her nap in afternoons, the morning he'd found her bent over behind the barn being sick, and she'd blamed it on bad meat from dinner. "I'm pregnant." The words emerged quiet but certain. "Maybe 8 weeks, maybe more. I wasn't sure until yesterday when Kimimela asked me why I was showing signs." She finally looked at him, and her eyes held fear so raw it hurt to witness. "I know we never talked about this. I know this changes everything. But this baby is mine. Ours. Not tribal obligation, not repayment of debt. I choose to have it." Marcus's mind went blank for 3 full seconds, all thought suspended, while his body processed what his brain couldn't yet grasp. Pregnant. Dawn was pregnant. They were going to have a child. The implications cascaded through him faster than he could catalog them. Joy and terror and grief all tangled together, memories of Emily, mixing with images of future he hadn't dared imagine. Awareness that children made you vulnerable in ways nothing else could. His hands shook as he reached for her, pulled her close despite the awkward angle, pressed his face into her hair, while his throat worked around words that wouldn't come. She was crying. He realized silent tears that wet his shirt, her body trembling against his, with emotions she'd been holding back until this moment. "Are you angry?" Her voice broke. "Do you want me to?" "No." He found his voice rough and fierce. "God, no, I'm not angry. I'm terrified and amazed, and I think maybe the happiest I've been since before Sarah died." He pulled back enough to see her face to make sure she heard him clearly. "This baby is wanted. You're wanted. Whatever comes, we face it together." Her face crumbled with relief, and she kissed him with desperation that spoke of how much fear she'd carried before this conversation, how much uncertainty about his reaction. He kissed her back and tasted salt and tried to communicate through touch. What words couldn't adequately express that she'd just given him something he thought he'd lost forever? The possibility of being father again, of watching life grow and teaching it and protecting it. When they finally broke apart, Dawn's face had settled into something approaching peace, though worry still lingered in her eyes. The tribe will want this child. Tribal law says children born to Apache mothers belong to the tribe must be raised Apache way. Her hand tightened on his. "They might leave us alone now, but when they learn I'm carrying baby counsel, will say child is their property. They'll come to take it." The threat crystallized in Marcus's mind with clarity that bordered on painful. A child gave the council leverage they hadn't possessed before, gave them justification for renewed intervention, meant the fragile peace of the past 6 weeks could shatter the moment Dawn's pregnancy became visible enough for scouts to notice. They couldn't hide it forever, couldn't pretend, and the Free People's presence on his land meant word would reach the original band eventually, no matter how carefully they tried to control information. "Then we make sure they understand coming for our child means war. Not just defense, but active retaliation." The words emerged harder than Marcus intended, shaped by protections that made his earlier violence seem restrained. "We fortify, better train harder, prepare for siege that might last weeks. And if they come anyway, we make them bleed for every inch." Dawn's hand covered his where it rested on her stomach, their fingers interlacing over the place where their child grew. "I won't let them take this baby. Would die first, would kill first." Her voice carried absolute conviction. "This is my child, my choice, my family. No one owns us anymore." They sat together while the sun climbed above the horizon, painting everything gold. And Marcus thought about how 8 months ago he'd been alone and waiting to die. And now he was preparing to defend a woman he loved and a child he hadn't known existed until 5 minutes ago. And somehow that transformation felt both impossible and inevitable, like his entire life had been leading to this moment when everything that mattered was at stake. The news spread through the Free People by midday, despite Dawn's wish to keep it private for a while longer. Kimimela's knowing looks and the other women's sudden increased attentiveness made secrecy impossible. And by evening, the entire camp knew that Dawn carried Marcus's child, that the white rancher and the Apache widow had created something new together. The reactions ranged from celebration to concern, people understanding this meant their safety was no longer guaranteed, that the council would have to respond to this development. Neshoba found Marcus near the barn. As sun was setting, his expression troubled. "You know what this means. What will come now?" "I know." Marcus continued checking the horse's hooves, using the physical task to occupy his hands. "How long do we have?" "Council meets under new moon, 4 days from now. They'll discuss whether to try taking the child before birth or waiting until after." Neshoba leaned against the barn wall, arms crossed. "Some will argue waiting, claiming baby doesn't matter until it's born. Others will say Dawn's pregnancy itself is insult to tribal law, that she should be forced back immediately to give birth under council supervision." Marcus set down the horse's hoof, straightened to face the warrior. "And if they decide to come for her for the baby, then it won't be small raid like last time. Will be coordinated assault with enough warriors to overwhelm us through numbers. Council has seen we can defend, so they'll bring overwhelming force. Maybe 50 warriors, maybe more if they call on allied bands." Neshoba's face showed the strain of divided loyalties. "My people, the Free People, will fight with you, but 50 against 28, even with fortifications, those odds aren't good." The math was brutal and unavoidable. Last time they'd barely survived 16 attackers with the element of surprise and defensive position working in their favor. 50 trained warriors attacking prepared position with nothing to lose meant casualties neither side could afford, meant almost certain defeat even if they inflicted heavy damage in the process. Marcus's mind raced through options, discarding strategies as fast as he conceived them. They could run, but Dawn's pregnancy made long-distance travel increasingly difficult, and running just delayed the inevitable confrontation while surrendering the defensive advantages of prepared ground. They could try negotiating, but what did they have to negotiate with? The council wanted Dawn and the child, and neither was available for compromise. We need to change the equation. Need something that makes attacking us more costly than they're willing to pay. Marcus thought about his cavalry years, about asymmetric warfare and leverage points. What if we didn't wait for them to come to us? What if we took the fight to them? Neshoba's eyebrows rose. Attack the council. That's suicide. Their camp has 200 people, warriors everywhere. Defensive positions we couldn't breach even with cavalry support. Not attack, pressure, hit their supply lines, make it expensive for them to maintain large fighting force, demonstrate. We can strike back if they strike us. Marcus felt the plan crystallizing even as he spoke. Force them to negotiate from position of uncertainty rather than strength. The warrior considered this, his expression shifting from skepticism to cautious interest. You want to fight guerrilla war against my former band. Use their own tactics against them. Unless you have better idea. Neshoba was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant, like he was running scenarios in his head, calculating odds and outcomes. Finally, he looked at Marcus directly, something like respect in his eyes. It might work, but would require perfect coordination, people willing to risk their lives on raids that might not change anything. And if we fail, Council will have justification for total war, for wiping out the free people entirely. If we do nothing, they come anyway. At least this way we're choosing how the fight happens. Marcus glanced toward the cabin where Dawn was helping women prepare evening meal, her hand unconsciously resting on her stomach in gesture that was becoming habitual. I won't let them take her. Won't let them take our child. I'll burn down the world first. The intensity in his voice seemed to surprise Neshoba, made the warrior reassess the white rancher who'd seemed soft when Dawn first arrived. You love her. Really love her, not just white man taking advantage of Apache woman. I love her, and I choose to protect what I love this time instead of being 3 days away when it matters. The old guilt rose up and Marcus used it as fuel. So yes, I'll fight guerrilla war against your former band if that's what survival requires. I'll do whatever it takes. Neshoba nodded slowly, decision made. Then we plan, but we do it right with people who understand what they're risking. And we give Dawn choice in this because it's her life we're fighting over. They brought the proposal to Council of Free People that night. 28 souls gathered around central fire, while Marcus and Neshoba explained the situation, the threat, the response they were proposing. Faces showed mixture of fear and determination, people who'd already chosen risk over safety, once now being asked to double down on that choice. The discussion went late into night, voices rising and falling in Apache that Marcus couldn't follow, but whose emotional tenor needed no translation. Dawn finally spoke, her voice cutting through debate like blade through rope. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but he understood the effect, the way people's faces changed, the way heads nodded and spines straightened and hands moved to weapons in gesture of readiness. When she finished, silence held for 3 heartbeats before Neshoba stood and spoke one word that Marcus recognized from his cavalry days. Yes, in Apache, the sound of commitment being made. Later, alone in their cabin with fire burning low, Marcus asked what she'd said. Dawn's hand found his in the darkness, laced their fingers together. I told them we are free people because we choose to be free. That freedom means nothing if we give it up the moment someone threatens to take it away. Her voice carried quiet strength. I told them our child represents everything we're fighting for, right to choose who we love, where we live, how we raise our families. If we let Council take that, we were never really free, just waiting for permission to live. Marcus pulled her close, careful of the stomach that was just starting to show curve beneath her dress, and thought about the fact that 6 months ago he'd had nothing to live for, and now he had everything to lose. The transformation felt complete, the journey from death wish to desperate life preservation. and he understood with clarity that sometimes salvation looked like another person choosing you, despite all the reasons they shouldn't. I'm going to be a father again. He said it aloud, testing how the words felt, letting reality sink in properly. I'm terrified I'll fail, that I'll lose you both the way I lost Emily and Sarah. Dawn's hand pressed against his chest directly over his heart. You won't lose us. We won't let you. We're stronger together than anything that comes for us. She paused, breath warm against his neck. And if worst happens, if I don't survive birth or council takes me, you promise me something. Don't talk like that. Promise me you'll raise this child to know they were wanted, that they came from choice, not obligation, that their mother loved them enough to fight world to give them chance at free life. Her voice broke slightly. Promise me they'll know what it means to choose. Marcus's throat closed around words grief and love, tangled too tightly to separate. He managed to nod, managed to whisper, I promise. And then they were holding each other in the darkness while the fire died and the future pressed against them like physical weight. The raids began 3 days later, coordinated strikes against council's hunting parties and supply caches, carefully chosen targets that caused disruption without killing unless absolutely necessary. Neshoba led most of them, taking warriors who knew the terrain and the council's patterns, hitting fast and fading before response could materialize. They stole dried meat stores, drove off horse herds, destroyed water containers, cached at strategic locations, made it expensive for the council to maintain military readiness. Marcus stayed at the homestead, defending the settlement while the raids were underway, and the waiting was worse than combat, the not knowing if his people would return, if the strategy was working, or just hastening the inevitable confrontation. Dawn helped him fortify further, adding defensive positions and escape routes, despite her advancing pregnancy, limiting what she could physically do. The pregnancy changed her in ways beyond the physical. She moved slower, tired more easily, but there was new softness to her that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the life she carried. Marcus caught her sometimes standing with her hands on her stomach, talking quietly in Apache to the child growing inside her, and the intimacy of those moments made his chest ache with love, so intense it bordered on painful. Kimimela took on role as Dawn's protector, hovering nearby whenever Dawn was outside, rifle in hand and eyes scanning for threats. The two women would sit together for hours, Kimimela teaching Dawn traditional Apache birthing practices, while Dawn taught her more English, their friendship deepening into something that looked like sisterhood. Watching them, Marcus understood that they were building community in the truest sense, people choosing to care for each other, not because obligation demanded it, but because connection required it. The council's response to the raids came faster than expected. A delegation arrived 2 weeks after the guerrilla campaign began, 5 older warriors under white flag requesting parley with Neshoba and Marcus. They met at neutral ground between the property's weapons visible but not raised, and the lead warrior, a man with scarification that marked him as council member, spoke in careful English, clearly meant for Marcus to understand. You make war on us, take our supplies, scatter our horses, make it hard to feed our people. This is not behavior of those who want peace. Marcus let Neshoba respond first, giving the Apache warrior a chance to speak to his own people in their language, watching the exchange without understanding words, but reading body language well enough. Tension posturing, occasional gestures toward the homestead, hands moving to emphasize points. Finally, Neshoba switched to English. I told them we defend ourselves against those who would take Dawn and her child, that we will continue defending ourselves until council recognizes her right to live as she chooses. The council warrior's face darkened. The child is Apache, born to Apache mother. It belongs with its people, not with white man who seduced widow into breaking our laws. Rage flooded Marcus's veins, hot and immediate. No one seduced anyone. Dawn chose me the same way I chose her. And our child belongs to us, not to council that treats women like livestock. The insult landed hard, visible in the way the warrior's stiffened hands moving toward weapons, but the lead warrior held up one hand for stalling violence. You do not understand our ways. Our traditions exist to keep our people strong, to survive in a world where white men take our land and cavalry kills our children. Women must serve tribe to keep us alive. Your traditions are killing your people, Marcus shot back. That's why 28 of them chose to leave, chose to follow Neshoba instead of council. Because they'd rather risk freedom than continue living as property. Silence stretched between the two groups, thick with implications. Finally, the council warrior spoke again, his voice carrying weight of official pronouncement. We offer compromise. Dawn may stay with you, may raise child with you for first 5 years. But when child turns 5 winters, it returns to tribe for proper Apache education. This is final offer. Marcus looked at Neshoba, saw the warrior's slight headshake that said this wasn't compromise. This was council claiming future ownership while appearing reasonable. He thought about Emily, about raising a daughter for 5 years, and then having her ripped away, about the agony that would cause for any parent, but especially for Dawn, who'd already lost so much to forced compliance. No, the word came out flat, final. Our child stays with us. Was years, not just some years. That's our offer. The council warrior's face went hard as stone. Then there is no more talking. Council meets at new moon. Also, we will have answer then about what comes next. They left riding back toward their band's territory, and Marcus watched them go with the certainty that they just sealed their fate. War was coming, real war. The kind that ended with bodies in the ground and children growing up without parents. And he'd chosen that outcome by refusing to give away his child's future in exchange for temporary peace. Neshoba's hand landed on his shoulder, heavy with shared understanding. You did right thing. Some prices are too high to pay, even for peace. Doesn't make what's coming any easier to face. No, but at least we face it standing up, choosing our own path. The warrior's grip tightened briefly, then released. We have until new moon, 11 days. We use them well. They spent those days preparing for siege that might last weeks, for battle that would determine whether the Free People survived as independent band or were absorbed back into traditional hierarchy. Marcus drilled defenders, relentlessly improving their marksmanship and coordination, building firing positions and fallback points, preparing for every scenario his tactical mind could conceive. Dawn organized the non-combatants, planning evacuation routes if defense failed, caching supplies for survival, if they had to scatter, maintaining hope that victory was possible, while preparing for possibility of defeat. And through it all, Marcus watched her stomach grow, watched his child develop inside the woman he loved, watched the future he wanted take physical form in a body that might not survive to protect that future. The fear lived in him constantly now, underlying everything, the awareness that he had more to lose than at any point since Sarah and Emily died, that the universe had given him second chance that could be taken away even more brutally than the first. On the 10th night, Dawn woke him from sleep that had been fitful at best. Marcus, feel this. She guided his hand to her stomach, and he felt it, the flutter of movement, unmistakable kick against his palm, their child announcing its presence. In the darkness, with war arriving tomorrow, they lay together, feeling their baby move and crying quietly because joy and terror had become indistinguishable, because loving something this much meant vulnerability that couldn't be armored against, because choosing life meant accepting that life could end. Whatever happens tomorrow, Dawn whispered, we had this. We chose each other, made this life together. That matters more than anything else. Marcus held her close and tried to believe she was right, tried to find peace in the choice they'd made, rather than fear in what might be taken. Outside, the new moon hung invisible in the sky, and somewhere in the darkness, warriors were preparing to take everything Marcus had left to lose. Dawn broke over the desert like a wound, opening red and violent and promising nothing but pain. Marcus stood on the porch with rifle in hand, watching the dust cloud on the horizon that meant the council's war party was coming, and he thought about how many mornings he'd stood in this exact spot wishing for death, and now that death approached, he'd never wanted to live more desperately. Behind him, the Free People took their positions with the calm efficiency of people who'd accepted what was coming, who'd made peace with the fact that today might be their last. Dawn moved among them, despite Marcus's protest that she should stay protected in the cabin, checking weapons and offering quiet words in Apache that seemed to steady nerves better than any speech Marcus could give. Her pregnancy showed clearly now, and at 4 months, the curve of her stomach, visible beneath the buckskin dress, and seeing her refuse to hide while carrying their child made something in Marcus's chest crack open with love, so profound it felt like breaking. The war party numbered exactly 50, just as Neshoba had predicted. They stopped beyond rifle range, arrayed in a line that stretched across Marcus's property line like a physical barrier between past and future. For long moments, nobody moved, both sides waiting to see who would commit first to violence that couldn't be undone. Then a single rider separated from the line, approaching under white flag. Marcus recognized him from the previous delegation, the council warrior with scarification marks, and watched as the man stopped 30 yards out and called across the distance. "Marcus Stone, the widow Dawn, we offer final chance. Give up the child when it is born. Raise it for first year, then return it to tribe. This is more than council wanted to give, but elders have decided to show mercy." Dawn stepped forward before Marcus could respond, her voice carrying across the space with the force of absolute conviction. "I am not widow anymore. I am Dawn. I chose my name, chose my man, chose my life. And I will raise my child all years, not just some years. No compromise on this." The warrior's face showed frustration, warring with something that might have been respect. "Then there is no more talking. We take you back by force, and the white man who harbors you will die with all those who chose rebellion over wisdom." "Wait." Neshoba's voice rang out as he moved to stand beside Dawn, his lightning bolt scar vivid in the morning light. "I challenge council's authority and under old laws. You claim to preserve Apache ways, but you violate the oldest way right of individual to seek vision, to follow paths shown by spirits. Dawn had vision. Spirits told her to leave to find new life. You deny her vision. You deny Apache tradition deeper than any council ruling." The claim hung in the air, and Marcus saw the war parties shift, warriors exchanging glances, the invocation of spiritual authority creating uncertainty where there had been only resolve. The lead warrior's face went pale because challenging someone's vision path was taboo, even in bands that had largely converted to Christianity, superstition that ran deeper than logic. "She had no vision. She runs from duty, nothing more." "She had vision." Kimimela's voice joined from her position on the barn roof. "I witnessed it. Night before she came to Marcus Stone, she spoke of dreams, showing white man with dead daughter, showing cabin that needed two hearts to live again. She followed her vision here. You attack her, you attack spirit-guided path." The lie was beautiful and perfectly pitched, the kind of claim that couldn't be disproven and carried enough cultural weight to give warriors reason to hesitate. Marcus saw doubt spreading through the war party men who'd come prepared to kill traitors, but weren't prepared to violate spiritual law, and he understood this was the moment everything balanced on the instant where trajectory could shift if they pushed hard enough. "I had vision too." Marcus stepped forward, improvising wildly. "Spirits of my dead family told me to save Dakota, told me dawn would come, told me we would make new life from old death. You attack us, you attack what the spirits ordained. You want that on your souls." The lead warrior looked genuinely shaken, now his certainty crumbling in the face of multiple claimed visions, spiritual authority stacked against military authority. He turned his horse, rode back to confer with other leaders in the war party, and Marcus held his breath while the discussion raged, watching for the moment decision crystallize one way or another. It took 10 minutes that felt like hours. Then the warriors began turning their horses, first 1, then 5, then 20, peeling away from the line and heading back toward their original band's territory. Not all 15 remained the hardliners who didn't care about vision paths or spiritual authority, who'd come to enforce council will and intended to follow through regardless. But 35 leaving meant the odds had just shifted from impossible to merely terrible. The lead warrior stayed with the 15, his face set in grim lines. "Those who left are weak. We who remain will do what must be done." He raised his arm, and the remaining warriors charged. The battle that followed was shorter and more brutal than the first fight, 15 determined men against 28 defenders in prepared positions. Marcus fired until his rifle was empty, grabbed another, kept firing until that was empty too, until his shoulder screamed protest and his hands shook from recoil, and 3 warriors lay dead in his yard while the others retreated beyond rifle range to regroup. Dawn fought beside him with bow she'd taken from fallen warrior. During the first exchange, her arrows finding targets with accuracy that suggested she'd been trained as warrior before her forced marriage. She moved despite the pregnancy, despite Marcus's shouted demands that she'd take cover, and he realized with sick clarity that she would rather die fighting than hide while others protected her. The remaining 12 warriors they'd lost, 3 in the initial assault, regrouped and charged again, And this time they made it to the cabin itself, made it past the defensive perimeter through sheer desperate courage. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted, brutal close-quarters combat where training mattered less than willingness to kill, and Marcus found himself back-to-back with Neshoba, both of them cutting down attackers who kept coming like they had nothing left to lose. One warrior broke through toward Dawn, where she was reloading, war club raised, and Marcus's heart stopped because he was too far away, couldn't reach her in time, could only watch as his child and the woman he loved faced death he couldn't prevent. But Dawn dropped the bow, caught the descending club with her bare hand, absorbed the impact that should have shattered bone, and drove her knife into the warrior's throat, with her other hand in one fluid motion that spoke of muscle memory she'd never lost. The warrior fell, and Dawn stood over his body with her hand bleeding, where the club had connected, and Marcus saw her face transform into something that wasn't quite human, something fierce and ancient and utterly unbreakable. She caught his eye across the chaos, and her expression said she would kill everyone who threatened their child, would burn down the world if that's what survival required. The attack broke after that. The remaining warriors, seeing their numbers dwindling and their targets refusing to fold, began withdrawing, dragging wounded with them, leaving dead behind in testimony to the price of council's authority. The lead warrior was last to retreat, his face showing not hatred, but something closer to resignation, understanding that this fight was over, that the free people had won their independence through blood and wouldn't be reclaimed without cost that exceeded any possible benefit. He stopped at the property line, called back across the killing field one last time. "You have won today, but council will remember this. Will remember that their authority was challenged and that we did not prevail. Others will see, will wonder if they too can defy tradition. You may have broken more than you know." Then they were gone, disappearing into the desert, and Marcus was left standing in his yard surrounded by bodies. 4 of the free people dead, 6 council warriors dead. Victory that tasted like ash, because any death felt like too much death, like the universe extracting payment for happiness it never promised in the first place. Dawn collapsed, then the adrenaline that had sustained her draining away all at once, and Marcus caught her before she hit the ground, cradled her against his chest, while her blood from the injured hand soaked into his shirt. Kimimela appeared with medical supplies, began cleaning the wound while Dawn's eyes stayed fixed on Marcus's face. Is the baby okay?" Her voice shook for the first time since he'd known her. Kimimela's hands pressed gently against Dawn's stomach, feeling for movement, and the seconds stretched into eternity, while Marcus held his breath and prayed to God he wasn't sure he believed in that their child had survived the violence its mother had endured. Finally, Kimimela smiled. "Baby moves, strong movements. I think everything is fine." The relief that crashed through Marcus made his knees weak, and he lowered himself and Dawn to the ground together, just holding her, while she shook with delayed shock, while tears tracked down her face mixing with dust and blood, while their child kicked against his hand like it was announcing its determination to survive. They buried the dead that afternoon, free people and council warriors together, because Dawn insisted that even those who tried to kill them deserved proper burial. Marcus thought it was too generous but didn't argue, understanding she was trying to honor Apache traditions, even while defying others, trying to maintain connection to her heritage, while reshaping it into something that valued freedom over control. The days after the battle passed in that strange space between ending and beginning. They repaired damage to the cabin tended wounded, waited to see if the council would send more warriors or accept defeat. Scouts in Neshoba sent reported division within the original band. Younger members questioning council authority, women asking why Dawn's path wasn't available to them, the kind of internal fracturing that suggested the free people's existence was causing exactly the disruption the lead warrior had predicted. Marcus thought about that conversation about breaking more than they knew, and wondered if they'd started something that would ripple beyond their small settlement, beyond this particular band, into the broader Apache world where women were still property and choices were still limited. He hoped that Dawn's defiance would inspire others, but he also understood the cost of revolution, the way change always demanded blood before it delivered progress. 6 weeks later, with Dawn's pregnancy advancing toward the dangerous final months, a delegation arrived from the original band. Not warriors, but women, 8 of them, including 2 of the council elders' wives, approaching under peaceful signs with gifts of food and supplies. They asked to speak with Dawn alone, and Marcus let them, despite his protective instincts, trusting that Dawn could handle whatever they brought. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When the women emerged, Dawn's face showed tears mixed with something that looked like triumph. And she explained that the women had come to ask how to claim their own choices, how to resist without being killed, how to live as Dawn lived. The council was losing control, the women explained, because the wives and daughters and sisters had seen what freedom looked like, and they wanted it for themselves. They're starting their own quiet revolution, Dawn told Marcus that night, while they lay together with his hand resting on her stomach where their child grew. Not loud like ours, but persistent. Women refusing to marry men they don't choose. Widows refusing assignments they don't accept. Small resistances that add up to big change. Marcus thought about that, about how violence sometimes broke systems, but other times just propagated more violence, while quiet resistance compounded until systems collapsed under their own weight. Maybe both were necessary, the loud dramatic refusal that got attention, and the daily small refusals that accumulated until tradition couldn't sustain itself. Summer deepened toward autumn, and Dawn's body swelled with the life they'd created, and Marcus found himself thinking about names and futures, and all the things he thought he'd lost forever. They argued good-naturedly about whether their child would learn Apache or English first. Dawn insisted both simultaneously. Marcus worried that would be confusing. They compromised on teaching both and letting the child decide which felt more natural. They debated whether to expand the cabin now or wait until after birth, whether to plant winter crops or focus on fortifications, whether to believe the peace would hold or prepare for renewed conflict. In the end, they did all of it, building and planting and preparing, living as if they had forever, while accepting they might only have today. The Free People's Settlement grew more permanent, traditional shelters, giving way to more substantial structures, and watching the community develop around their homestead. Marcus understood they'd created something that mattered, something worth all the blood and fear and desperate fighting. Dawn went into labor on a cold October morning when the sky was the color of old iron and wind carried the promise of early snow. Kimamela and the Apache women who'd learned traditional midwifery took over, banishing Marcus from the cabin with orders to stay useful elsewhere, and he paced outside while his woman screamed and his child fought to be born helpless in a way that combat had never made him feel helpless. Labor lasted 14 hours. Marcus wore a path in the dirt, walking back and forth, his hands shaking every time Dawn's cries reached him through the cabin walls, his mind generating disaster scenarios faster than he could dismiss them. Neshoba sat with him for part of it, offering quiet companionship that required no words, and Marcus understood that he'd found brotherhood here, a connection forged through shared struggle that ran deeper than blood kinship. When the baby's first cry finally rang out, thin and furious and achingly alive, Marcus nearly collapsed with relief. Kimamela emerged moments later, her face exhausted but smiling, and gestured him inside. Dawn lay in the bed that had once been his alone, her face gray with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with emotion so profound it redefined what Marcus understood about love. In her arms, wrapped in soft blankets, was the smallest human Marcus had ever seen, their daughter, perfect and furious and demanding attention, but with cries that suggested she'd inherited her mother's refusal to be ignored. She's healthy, strong lungs, good color, all fingers and toes present. Kimamela's hand rested on Dawn's shoulder. Your woman did well. Baby did well. Everyone lives. Marcus crossed to the bed, sat carefully on the edge, looked at the tiny face scrunched up with newborn rage, and felt his heart expand to accommodate emotions he hadn't known existed. His finger touched the baby's hand, and her tiny fingers closed around it with grip that suggested she had no intention of letting go. And something in Marcus's chest that had been closed since Emily died finally opened all the way. What do we name her? His voice emerged rough, stripped raw by too many emotions happening simultaneously. Dawn looked up at him, then down at their daughter, her expression contemplative. I was thinking, Sarah, for your first wife, and Emily, for your first daughter. Sarah Emily Dawn Stone. So she carries all of us forward. The names hit Marcus like physical blows, reopening wounds he'd thought had scarred over. But the pain was clean this time, acknowledging loss without being consumed by it, honoring the dead while choosing to live. He nodded, unable to speak, and Dawn smiled. She'll know them. Through you. Through the stories you tell. They'll live in her, and that way they never die. Her hand covered his where it still held their daughter's tiny fist. That's how Apache think about ancestors. They travel with us, become part of who we are. Marcus leaned down, kissed Dawn's forehead, then kissed his daughter's, and thought about how love was always risk, how choosing to care about anything meant accepting eventual loss, but how refusing to love, because loss might come, was worse than any loss itself. Sarah Emily. Dawnstone would grow up knowing she was wanted, knowing she came from choice, not obligation, knowing her parents had fought the world to give her life that was hers to choose. Outside, the free people celebrated with songs that carried across the desert, welcoming new life into their community. And Marcus held his wife and daughter while they dozed, watching their faces in the lamplight, memorizing this moment, because joy was always temporary. But that didn't make it less real, less valuable, less worth fighting for. The months that followed passed in blur of sleepless nights and first smiles and watching their daughter grow with the speed that made time feel elastic. Sarah Emily, they called her Sarah for every day. Emily, only when Marcus told her stories about the sister she'd never meet, proved to have her mother's strength and her father's stubbornness, plus lungs that could wake the entire settlement when she decided she needed attention. The council sent no more warriors. Word reached them through scouts that the original band had split half following the old ways under new council leadership, half moving west to join other bands that were adapting to changing world, allowing more choice and less rigid hierarchy. The women's quiet revolution had succeeded where violence had only created stalemate, proved that some systems fell not from being attacked, but from being abandoned. Marcus thought about that often, about how Dawn's simple act of choosing her own path had rippled outward to change the world for women she'd never meet. How sometimes the most revolutionary thing you could do was refuse to accept that revolution was impossible. She'd been property, and she'd chosen to be person, and that choice had cost blood and terror and desperate fighting, but it had also created a future where their daughter would never have to choose between freedom and survival. Winter came early that year, snow falling in November, and not stopping until the desert was buried under white, that transformed everything into strange landscape where past and future felt equally distant. Marcus and Dawn would stand on their porch wrapped in blankets with Sarah between them, watching the Free People's Settlement, smoke rising into cold air, and feel something that had taken months to identify as peace. Not the absence of conflict threats still existed. Cavalry patrols still passed close enough to make everyone nervous. White settlers still looked at the Apache settlement with suspicion that could easily turn violent. But internal peace, the knowledge that they'd chosen each other and they'd keep choosing each other, that their family was built on bedrock of decision rather than sand of accident or obligation. One evening in late December, as they sat by the fire with Sarah sleeping in the cradle Marcus had built from wood that came from the barn they'd repaired together, Dawn spoke quietly. I was thinking about Dakota, about the debt he said needed repaying. I don't think he meant me serving you. I think he meant us saving each other. She looked at Marcus across the firelight, her face showing the contentment that came from surviving when survival seemed impossible. We were both dying when we met, just in different ways. You from grief, me from being treated like I wasn't human. And we chose to live instead. That was the debt. Life for life. Dakota's life giving us both permission to want our own lives. Marcus thought about that, about the old man dying in his cabin, about the words about debt that had seemed like burden, but had actually been gift, about how sometimes the universe gave you exactly what you needed in packages you didn't recognize until much later. He was wise, wiser than we knew. Marcus reached across the space between them, took Dawn's hand, laced their fingers together the way they'd done 100 times before. I'm glad he sent you here. Glad you chose to stay. Glad we chose each other. Every day, Dawn added, her voice carrying the weight of promise. We choose each other every day. That's what makes us unbreakable. They sat in comfortable silence while the fire burned and their daughter slept, and the desert wind carried promises of spring that would come eventually, that always came eventually, that they would see together because they'd survived winter, and winter was always the hardest season. Outside, the free people settled in for the night, and inside the cabin that had been tombed for so long, life continued in all its messy, complicated, beautiful reality. Marcus looked at his wife now. They'd married in ceremony that blended Apache and white traditions until something new emerged in his daughter, and thought about how love wasn't destiny or fate, or anything written in stars. It was choice made daily, made hourly, made in every moment when you could walk away, but decided to stay instead. In staying, choosing to stay, choosing each other despite everything that made choosing difficult or dangerous or seemingly impossible. That was what made them family, made them free, made them finally, fully, completely alive.